Chapter 1. The song in the foggett was nearly midnight when the knock came. I had been dozing in my armchair before the fire, the Times spread over my lap, when the sound stirred me sharply awake. The soft rattle of rain against the windows and the persistent wail of the wind beyond Baker Street had lulled me into a quiet reverie. But that knock, firm, deliberate, and unhurried, had the character of something unusual. Opposite me, Sherlock Holmes sat cross-legged upon the hearth-rug, deep in contemplation, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. A single oil lamp cast elongated shadows across the room, and the scent of tobacco hung heavily in the air. He did not look up. "A late visitor," I ventured, rising to my feet. "So it would seem," Holmes replied evenly. "Open the door, Watson, and do try not to look quite so astonished. It is not the first time mystery has called upon us after dark." I crossed to the door and opened it. The man who stood upon the threshold was tall and thin, soaked through to the skin, and dressed in a long dark coat that clung to him like a second skin. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his face, but his voice, when he spoke, was rich and musical, like a trained baritone. "Dr. John Watson," he asked, "and Mr. Sherlock Holmes. You've found us," I said. "Do come in." He stepped inside, dripping water onto the floor, and removed his hat with an elegant motion. He was perhaps in his early 40s, with dark hair swept back from a high forehead, and eyes that held an intense, almost fevered gleam. There was something of the stage about him. He moved with theatrical grace, and his gaze swept the room as if it were a set. "My name is Enoch Darnley," he said. I have come to you on a matter of extreme delicacy, and I fear grave danger." Holmes rose from his position before the fire, brushing ash from his dressing gown. "Mr. Darnley," he said, "singer, if I am not mistaken. A baritone, though. You can also manage the tenor range with some skill. You recently returned to London after a 2-year tour of Italy. And you've had a fright, though I doubt it has anything to do with the weather." Darnley's expression froze, then melted into something like admiration. "Your reputation does not exaggerate, Mr. Holmes. Please," Holmes said, gesturing to the armchair beside the fire. "Warm yourself. Watson, perhaps some brandy." Fetched it without a word, intrigued already. Holmes perched on the edge of the divan, his grey eyes fixed upon our guest. "You spoke of danger," he said. "Begin at the beginning, if you please." Darnley accepted the glass I handed him and took a sip before speaking. "I live in Chelsea," he said. "I returned to London 3 weeks ago, after completing a modest but well-received tour of Naples and Florence. Upon my return, I rented rooms on Harrington Gardens, quiet, respectable, and convenient to Covent Garden, where I've had the pleasure of singing more than once." He paused to warm his hands before the fire, staring into the flames. 3 nights ago, just before midnight, I heard something outside my window. A song, clear, pure, sung in a woman's voice. It was haunting, mournful, but, how shall I say this, impossibly beautiful. I opened the window and saw no one. The street was empty. Holmes nodded. "What was the song?" "I didn't recognize it. Not any language I know. Latin, perhaps, or something more archaic. But I felt it, Mr. Holmes, in my bones. It was not just music. It was a message." "A message to whom?" Darnley turned to look at him, eyes narrowed. To me. Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then, go on. The following night, the same thing happened. At the stroke of midnight, the voice returned. This time it sang closer, beneath my window, I believe. Again, I saw no one. But the melody was different, not mournful this time, urgent, angry perhaps, I'm not sure. But I woke with a sense of dread. I couldn't sleep afterward. And last night, Holmes asked, that's when I knew I must come to you. I heard the voice again, closer still, louder, but not just the voice. There was a figure, a woman in white, standing at the corner of the street, pale, motionless. She sang without moving her lips, Mr. Holmes, and when I called out, she vanished. I felt a chill run down my spine. Holmes leaned forward. What do you mean, vanished? She was simply gone. I ran, downstairs at once, threw open the front door, but the street was empty. I searched the length of it. Nothing, not a soul. You believe her to be a ghost, then? I asked. Darnley gave me a curious look. No, Doctor. I do not believe in ghosts. I believe in murder. That silenced us. Holmes steepled his fingers again, eyes glittering in the lamplight. Explain. Darnley hesitated, then reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sheet of music. This was left on my doorstep this morning. Holmes took it, examined it briefly, then passed it to me. It was a single stave of handwritten musical notation, with lyrics written in careful cursive beneath the notes. The language was not one I recognized, and yet the script was elegant, almost ceremonial. Holmes said, Do you know what this says? I do not, Darnley replied, but I showed it to a colleague at the Royal Academy. He believes the language to be Old Occitan, troubadour dialect. It hasn't been spoken in centuries. Holmes's eyes flickered with interest. And what does your colleague believe it means? Darnley took another sip of brandy before answering. He translated it roughly as, The betrayal of the voice shall be repaid in blood. Phew! Room fell into silence once more. Holmes stood and began to pace. Have you wronged anyone, Mr. Darnley? Anyone in love or in song? A performer is bound to offend or outshine. But have you reason to believe someone bears you hatred? Darnley hesitated. There is one, a woman. Her name is Elira Valenne, a singer, brilliant, passionate, a creature of stage and fire. We were once close. We performed together in Venice. And, Holmes prompted, she believed I betrayed her. I did not. But circumstances led her to ruin, and she has never forgiven me. I heard she returned to France last year. I have not seen her since. Holmes turned sharply. Is she capable of this sort of theatrical torment? Darnley gave a hollow laugh. If you had met her, you would not ask. She is capable of much worse. I see, Holmes murmured. I glanced at him. You believe this Elira Valenne to be involved? I believe, Holmes said, that a singer haunted by a phantom voice and a threat written in the language of medieval love poetry warrants investigation. Darnley rose, setting down his glass. Will you take the case, Mr. Holmes? Holmes nodded once. Yes, but I will not pursue shadows, Mr. Darnley. You say you do not believe in ghosts. Neither do I. There is a flesh-and-blood answer to this, and we shall find it. When shall we begin? Holmes moved to the window and pulled back the curtain. The rain had ceased, and the fog outside swirled like smoke over the gas lamps of Baker Street. "Now," he said, "the game, as they say, is afoot." Chapter 2. A Voice in Harrington Gardens. The fog clung to the cobbles like a living thing as we arrived at Harrington Gardens. Though past midnight, the gas lamps still burned with their dim orange flicker, throwing uncertain light over the row of elegant townhouses that lined the street. The houses stood silent and dignified, their windows shuttered against the wind, their facades dark save for the occasional faint glow from within. The quiet of the hour made every footfall feel magnified, every breath visible in the chill air. Enoch Darnley led us with quick steps to the third house from the corner. "This is it," he said, unlocking the front door and stepping aside to let us pass. "I occupy the top floor." Holmes entered without a word, eyes scanning every corner of the vestibule, noting the umbrella stand, the faint marks of recent footprints on the tile and a smudge of something dark on the banister. Mud or soot, perhaps. He trailed his fingers along the wood, his expression unreadable. We climbed the stairs to the third floor, where Darnley unlocked a second door and ushered us into a modest but stylish flat. It bore all the signs of a refined bachelor's life. Piano near the window, piles of sheet music on the side table, and framed posters of past performances lining the walls. A decanter of sherry stood untouched beside two crystal glasses. Holmes wandered to the window and peered out. "This overlooks the street, yes?" Darnley nodded. "That's where I saw her, the woman in white, at the far end near the wrought iron gate." Holmes unlatched the window and pushed it open. A gust of damp night air swept in, fluttering the edge of a nearby curtain. "You heard her voice from here?" "I did." Holmes tilted his head slightly, as if straining to listen to echoes from the past. Then he turned abruptly. "Come, Watson, let us see what the street has to say." We descended once more and stepped out into the night. Holmes moved with swift certainty down the pavement towards the end of the road. A cast-iron gate marked the division between Harrington Gardens and the private mews beyond, locked at night, Darnley told us, with only residents possessing keys. Holmes knelt at the gate, examining the gravel and paving stones beneath the lamplight. I crouched beside him, but to my eye the street was unmarked, unremarkable. Yet Holmes leaned forward with sudden interest and plucked something from a crack. "Between the stones, a thread," he murmured, holding it up. "White silk, torn, no doubt, from a garment." Darnley inhaled sharply. "She wore white, I'm certain of it." "Indeed," Holmes said. "And what's this?" He pointed to a faint impression in the gravel. A slight indentation, perhaps, a footprint, though mostly obscured by the shifting fog and rain. He studied it a moment longer, then rose to his feet. "She was here," he said simply. "Or someone was. But whether she came alone, or how she left, is less clear." Turned back toward the house. A faint sound drifted on the air, soft, melodic, like the tail end of a note hummed into silence. Holmes froze mid-step. "Did you hear it?" "I did," I said, my skin prickling. Darnley looked pale. "It's her." Holmes held up a hand for silence. We waited. For a moment there was only wind and mist. Then barely audible, a few notes, sung in a pure, chilling tone, rising and falling with haunting precision. The voice seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Up," Holmes said suddenly. "The rooftops." We raced back inside and up to the flat. Holmes flung open the window once more and leaned out. The voice had ceased. "There are adjoining roofs," he said. "Low enough to climb if one is agile or desperate." Darnley joined him at the window. "You think she was up there?" "I think someone was. This is not the work of phantoms, Mr. Darnley. This is theatre. Elaborate, yes. Supernatural, no." He turned to me. "Watson, do you recall the tread of that stair? The creak on the second landing?" "I do. We made it twice, yet heard nothing after we returned outside. If someone had entered or left, we would have known. Ergo, our singer did not enter the house." "Then how?" "Precisely the question." Holmes moved to the fireplace and examined the stone hearth. He knelt, running his fingers along the inner edge. Then he looked up. "Tell me, Mr. Darnley, has your chimney ever been cleaned?" Darnley blinked. "Not since I moved in, no." "Why?" Holmes didn't answer directly. Instead, he rose and examined the edge of the rug near the hearth. There was a faint dusting of soot along the border, and one small smear, like the print of a gloved hand. Holmes straightened, his eyes gleaming. "She came down the chimney," he said. "What?" I exclaimed. Holmes gestured. "It's absurd, but not impossible. If she or he is slight enough and the flue wide enough, it's a plausible point of entry. It explains the silence and the soot." "But to what end?" I asked. Holmes turned to Darnley. "That is what we must discover. But first, we must consider the music." He crossed to the piano and sat with uncharacteristic grace, laying the sheet of music we had brought with us atop the stand. He studied it for a long moment, then played the melody. It was haunting. Even without lyrics, the tune felt older than time, full of loss and longing. It hung in the air like incense, the final note drifting into stillness. Holmes sat motionless for several seconds, then looked up. "This is no idle composition. This is a cipher." "A cipher?" I asked. "Indeed, a code, hidden within the music itself." Darnley looked stunned. "I never thought—" "Of course not. That is the point. Few but the musically literate would think to analyze melody for meaning. But look here. Note the intervals. The sequence is not natural. Repeating notes correspond with specific letters if translated according to the diatonic scale. It is not complete, not yet. But I believe we are meant to decipher something quite specific." He tapped the sheet. "The betrayal of the voice shall be repaid in blood. An accusation. A warning. Perhaps a promise." Darnley sat heavily in a chair. "I don't understand. Why me?" "That is the other question, is it not?" Holmes said. "Your connection to Elira Verlaine cannot be coincidence. Tell me, did she ever write music herself?" "She composed, yes," Darnley said slowly. "Obscure things, beautiful but strange. She believed she was the reincarnation of a troubadour. She said the past spoke through her." Holmes nodded. "Then it's likely this is her work, or someone imitating it. There was a knock at the door, sharp, hurried. Holmes answered. A uniformed constable stood in the corridor, hat in hand. "Beg pardon, sir," he said. "We've just had a report. A woman's body's been found in a mews near here. Pale skin, white dress. You're to come at once." Darnley paled. Dear God! Holmes's face was stone. "Lead the way!" We followed the constable through the back gate and down a narrow, cobbled passage. The fog had thickened, swirling in ghostly tendrils. At the far end, several officers were gathered, their lanterns casting flickering light over something crumpled on the ground. A woman, young, pale, her white dress was torn and damp with rain. Her eyes stared upward, wide, glassy, lifeless. A deep red wound cut across her throat. Darnley gave a cry and turned away. Holmes knelt beside the body, examining her with clinical detachment. He touched the edge of the wound and sniffed lightly. "Fresh," he murmured. "Less than an hour. The killer is near." I looked down, heart thudding. In the woman's clenched hand was a scrap of paper. Holmes pried it loose and read aloud. "The voice has been silenced. Let the lyre sing alone." His gaze shifted to Darnley. "Well, Mr. Darnley," he said, folding the note, "it seems your midnight visitor has turned deadly." Chapter 3. The Silent Room. The dead woman's face remained with me long after we returned to Baker Street, the glassy stillness of her eyes haunting my thoughts like a spectre. She had been young, perhaps no older than 23, and though unfamiliar to us, the manner of her death struck far too close to the disturbing melody Holmes had deciphered from the sheet left for Mr. Darnley. Someone had composed a message in music and punctuated it with murder. Holmes was a man of swift energy and rare stillness. Upon returning to our sitting room at 221B, he did not immediately light his pipe or throw himself into his armchair, as was often his custom following a case's first dark turn. Instead, he moved restlessly about the room, hands behind his back, head bowed, as though tracing invisible patterns in the air. I have seen murder cloaked in jealousy, in greed, in hatred, he said suddenly. But revenge dressed in harmony, now that is a rare composition. "You believe this to be revenge, then?" I asked. "Revenge or its theatrical cousin? The killer has struck with music, Watson, with cymbals and staging. A white dress, a wound as clean as a soprano's high C. This is no impulse, it is performance." He turned to his desk and unrolled the sheet of music once more. "The cipher is too elegant to be casual. This was constructed, designed by someone with a knowledge of music, of codes, and of the human psyche, someone who knows how to frighten without being seen." "And the victim?" I asked. "She is not a Lyra Verlaine." "No," Holmes replied, "but I suspect she is an echo of her." "A singer?" "Almost certainly. Likely one trained in the same circles, perhaps even a student of the same teacher. The killer chose her not at random, but by resemblance." A knock interrupted our speculation. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a telegram on a silver tray. "For you, Mr. Holmes." "Arrived just now. I thought it best to bring it up straight away." Holmes took the envelope, opened it, and read aloud. "Second, verse to be sung at dusk. You will hear the melody when the windows weep. V." He stood silent for a long moment. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he handed me the paper. "Who signs themselves V?" I asked. Holmes's voice was grave. "A performer, or someone pretending to be one." He moved again to the fireplace, gazing into the empty grate. "There is a mind at work here, Watson. A mind that thinks in staves and tempo, not logic and motive. We must understand its rhythm if we are to prevent the next act. But what of the windows weeping? I asked. Holmes's eyes met mine, and a curious smile played across his lips. That, Watson, is the question that will bring us to the next scene. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, a cold drizzle began to fall, pattering against the windows with a steady whisper. Holmes had been entirely silent for over an hour, save for brief mutterings as he compared notes between the ciphered music and several obscure books on cryptographic theory. He had retrieved the Rosetta of musical ciphers from his private shelf, an unusual treatise printed in 1841 and bound in faded red cloth, and spent the greater part of the morning comparing it to the melody left in Darnley's flat. Then, precisely as the light began to dim, Holmes straightened. "Dusk approaches," he said, "and if our correspondent remains true to form, another message is near." He crossed to the window, now streaked with rain, and leaned close. "Listen." At first there was nothing. Then a single tone, not loud, not even clear at first, but it rose with uncanny clarity through the wet hush of the city. A few soft notes carried on some hidden instrument, perhaps a violin or a flute. It was the same melody, but inverted, played backward with different emphasis, almost mournful. "Downstairs," Holmes said suddenly, seizing his coat. We dashed out into the damp street, our boots splashing through shallow puddles. The music was clearer now, coming from somewhere not far from our own doorstep, barely more than a block away. Holmes followed it unerringly, like a hound on scent, until we came to a narrow alley off Montague Street. There, beneath the awning of an old bookshop, stood a man. He was tall, lean, and shrouded in a long grey coat. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face. In his gloved hands he held a flute, silver and gleaming. He played with a precision that seemed almost mechanical. Holmes approached slowly. "A wet day for performance," he said. The man stopped playing, but did not look up. "The voice is not dead," he said softly, "only silenced." "Are you the one who calls himself V?" The man said nothing. Holmes took a step closer. "Who was she?" Still silence. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "I have seen precision in the hands of soldiers and killers alike. Your playing was not artistic. It was a code, just as before. You do not wish to be understood by many, just one." The man's head turned slightly. The lyre must sing, alone. Then he stepped back into the fog, disappearing with sudden fluid grace. Holmes darted forward, but the alley was empty. No footprints, no echo. Only the fading pattern of notes still clinging to the air. I caught up beside him. "He vanished." "No," Holmes said. "He performed an exit. He retrieved something from the ground. A card. Upon it was printed, "The Silent Room, 14, Elysian Lane, tonight." Holmes read it with narrowed eyes. The second verse. Elysian Lane was barely a street, more of a crooked passage wedged between two neglected warehouses near the docks. At number 14 we found a tall building, its upper floors in darkness, the windows boarded or cracked. But the door was ajar, and from within came the faint hum of something electric. Lights, perhaps. or a phonograph? Holmes entered without hesitation. I followed, my nerves taut with anticipation. Inside, the space was lit by a single oil lamp hung from the rafters. The walls were lined with velvet drapes, faded and moth-eaten. At the centre of the room stood a single chair, facing a raised platform no more than 2 feet tall. Upon the platform sat a gramophone, needle poised above a blank wax disc, and beside the gramophone, another body, a man this time, middle-aged, with a silver chain across his waistcoat and spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He was slumped forward, throat cut in the same precise arc as the girl the night before. Holmes knelt, examining the body. He was a teacher, stared. "How can you know that?" Holmes lifted the man's left hand. The fingers bore the faint calluses of constant contact with strings and keys. "Music," he said, "but not performance, instruction. The where is wrong for the concert hall. This man taught." He moved to the gramophone and examined the needle, then the disc. "Not blank," he said, "scratched over." He placed the needle down gently and wound the machine. With a faint crackle, the wax began to spin. From it issued a voice, female, clear and mournful. "Do not weep when I am gone. My voice is not mine. It was borrowed from the sea." A pause. "I did not sing for you or for them. I sang because I must, and for that I was punished." Another pause. "Now let them hear silence." The record ended in a hiss. Holmes's face was unreadable. The past sings louder than we know. "Do you think this is Elira Verlaine?" I asked. Holmes didn't answer immediately. He walked the room slowly, touching the drapes, the floorboards, the walls. Then he stopped, turned toward me and said, "There is a stage here, a ghostly one perhaps, but the performance is far from over, and now we know the tune." He picked up a small envelope placed on the seat of the lone chair. Inside was another piece of sheet music. This one bore only a single line, annotated, in red ink, "When the bell tolls, the liar shall kneel." Holmes looked up. "We must speak to Mr. Darnley again, and learn exactly what lies he has told." Chapter 4. The Bell and the Liar. The following morning broke grey and unfeeling, the sort of dull smudged light that seemed to smear rather than illuminate. A mist had crept in from the Thames, and Baker Street had vanished behind a veil of fog. Holmes, as ever, had risen before me. I found him standing in his dressing gown by the window, arms folded, watching the invisible world outside with a gaze that missed nothing. "Darnley," he said without turning his head. "He lied to us." "About Elira?" Holmes gave a faint, dismissive gesture. "About many things, Watson, but most crucially about why he summoned us." He turned abruptly and moved to his desk, where the ciphered sheets lay once more alongside the gramophone disc we had retrieved the previous evening. He tapped a finger against the annotated sheet from the silent room. "When the bell tolls, the liar shall kneel. Tell me, Watson," he said, "what does a bell usually signify in performance?" "The curtain," I said. "Or an entrance," Holmes smiled faintly. "Or an ending. And what does a liar do when faced with judgment? Kneels, confesses, or dies." He strode to the coat stand, shrugging into his overcoat. "We are calling on Mr. Darnley again. But this time, Watson, I intend to ask the questions he did not anticipate." We arrived at Darnley's flat in Maida Vale just after 9. The street was still wet from the morning's drizzle, and the oil lamps cast a dull sheen on the cobblestones. The building was quiet, the doorman dozing behind his paper. Holmes led the way up without a word. To our surprise, Darnley answered almost at once, looking considerably more pale than when we'd first met him. His eyes were sunken, his hair uncombed, and there was a faint smell of cigar smoke clinging to the stale air inside. "Mr. Holmes," he said with something between fear and weariness. "Dr. Watson, I wasn't expecting—" "Then you haven't received the second verse," Holmes interrupted, stepping past him without invitation. Darnley's expression twitched, his lips half parting before closing again in a thin line. "I don't know what you mean." Holmes turned to him sharply. "I believe you do. Another victim was found last night. A man, a music teacher, murdered with the same precision as the girl. You were not summoned for your safety, Mr. Darnley. You were summoned to answer for something." Darnley paled further. I don't know who he was. But you knew Elira Valenne. That made him freeze. For a full 10 seconds, Darnley said nothing. Then softly, "Yes." Holmes nodded once. "I thought so." "She was a student of mine," Darnley said at last. "Years ago, at the conservatory, a rare voice, a fragile temperament. I didn't want to bring her into this. Her death was difficult enough." "Your student?" I asked. "And more than that, I presume?" Darnley gave a bitter little smile. "You're as sharp as they say, Doctor. Yes, we were involved. For a time. Foolishness mostly. She was young and burning with talent. I was older, arrogant, foolish in my own way. It ended badly." "Why badly?" Holmes asked. He did not look at Darnley as he posed the question, but moved instead around the apartment, scanning shelves and cabinets with eyes that absorbed everything. "She believed I had betrayed her," Darnley said, "that I had promised to recommend her for a position in Vienna. But I didn't. I recommended someone else." "Why?" Darnley looked away. "Because the other singer was better." Holmes raised an eyebrow. A cruel but honest admission. "She never forgave me," Darnley said quietly. "She left London shortly after. I heard rumours, breakdowns, failed performances, then silence. A few years later, I was told she'd died. How? Holmes asked. No one knew. Or if they did, no one would say. Just that she'd disappeared." Holmes turned to him fully now. "You received the ciphered sheet 2 days ago. Then you came to me. But you knew, immediately, who it might be about. I feared it, but I couldn't believe it." "And now?" Holmes asked. Darnley slumped into a chair. "Now I believe she's come back from the dead. Or someone wants me to think she has." Holmes crossed the room and held out the envelope we had found in the silent room. "Do you recognize this handwriting?" Darnley took it, turned it in his hands and nodded once. "Yes, it's hers." "So she lives." He looked up sharply. "Or someone has her hand, or her words." Holmes did not respond. He picked up a metronome from the mantel and turned it once. "One final question, Mr. Darnley. Who else knew of your history with Elira Valenne?" Darnley hesitated. "A few colleagues. Her old voice tutor, Sebastian Clay. He taught at the conservatory for decades. A woman named Mireille Garnier. Elira's closest friend. Where can we find them? Clay has a studio on Bentinck Street. Mireille. She lives alone now. I believe she teaches piano from her home in Hampstead. Holmes nodded. You will remain here. Expect another verse soon. Darnley stood. Do you think I'm in danger? Holmes gave him a long, unreadable look. Yes, but danger wears many disguises, and I am not yet certain which one waits behind your next curtain. Bentinck Street was quiet when we arrived, the kind of dignified stillness particular to the homes of men who live alone with their habits. The brass plate beside the door read Sebastian Clay, voice and stagecraft. Holmes rapped 3 times, then the door opened after a moment, revealing a gaunt man with a severe face and pale blue eyes that seemed incapable of blinking. His hair was white, though still full, swept back like a crest. He regarded us like specimens. I am Sebastian Clay, he said, and I don't take new students without audition. Holmes offered a small bow. Mr. Clay, we do not come to sing. We come with questions. Clay's eyes narrowed slightly. Then you may enter. The studio was cold and immaculate. Rows of chairs lined the walls, and a grand piano stood silent in the corner. Sheet music was stacked like architecture, and an oil portrait of a young woman hung above the fireplace. Elira Verlaine, Holmes murmured. Yes, Clay replied, my most gifted student. Is she dead? Clay's gaze did not shift from the portrait. She was dead before she left London. The world broke her. It did not deserve her voice. Did you remain in contact with her after her departure? She wrote to me once. A long, rambling letter, nearly mad. Spoke of voices in the dark, of being watched. She said the stage had turned to a mirror, and she no longer knew who was listening. Holmes absorbed this in silence, then asked, would you say she blamed anyone? Clay turned. She blamed herself and Darnley. Why? Because she loved him, and he was never willing to lose anything for her. Holmes's mouth tightened. Would you recognize her voice? Clay hesitated, then nodded. Yes, always. Holmes produced the gramophone disc. Then you must listen to this. Clay placed the disc on a player of his own and wound the crank. As the faint, mournful voice filled the studio, his expression did not change. But I saw a tremble pass through his hands. That, he said softly when it ended, is Elira Verlaine. Holmes gave a sharp breath. Then we are chasing a ghost. Who sings? Clay turned to him. Or someone who has taken her final note and made it their own. On the way back to Baker Street, Holmes was silent. The fog had thickened once more, and the gas lamps flickered like distant lighthouses. At last he said, a pattern is emerging, Watson. Of vengeance, of performance. Each murder is a movement in a larger composition. Each location, a stage. The audience, so far, is small. Darnley, you, me, and someone unseen who writes from the wings. And what of the bell? Holmes looked up into the gloom. The bell is the next cue, and I fear it tolls not for Darnley, but for someone he has forgotten. He paused. Or someone he believes he remembers wrongly. We had just reached our doorstep when a boy ran toward us from the mist, panting, clutching a telegram. Holmes took it, read it, and passed it to me. Third verse arrives tonight. The lyre sings in sleep. V. Holmes's jaw set. We have less than 12 hours. Chapter 5. The third verse. Nightfall descended like a velvet curtain. The streets were hushed, the fog drawn thick across London like breath on a mirror. I had barely lit the lamps in the sitting-room at Baker Street when Holmes emerged from his bedroom, fully dressed in his travelling coat, scarf, and gloves. In one hand he held the cryptic telegram, in the other his magnifying glass. He was restless, focused, yet still possessed of that peculiar calm which settled on him in the hours before danger broke fully upon us. I've reviewed the first and second verses, he said without preamble. Their cadence is musical, constructed in dactylic tetrameter, a deliberate rhythm found in certain archaic hymns. You think there's religious significance? I asked. He shook his head. No, the significance is theatrical. It's designed to sound like scripture, but its content is something else entirely. A score, a ritual of retribution set to meter and rhyme. He handed me the sheet. I read, When the bell tolls, the lyre shall kneel. When the voice breaks, the mask shall reveal. And when the stars fade, the silence shall steal. The breath from the lips of the one who can feel. The weight of it settled over me like a tombstone. Who sent it? I asked. Holmes moved to the fire. That is the question. Someone with access to a lyra's voice, if not the woman herself. Someone with a grievance old enough to sour into obsession. And I believe someone playing a role as carefully constructed as any opera villain. There was a knock at the door. Holmes motioned for silence and strode to answer it himself. Mrs. Hudson handed him an envelope. No messenger, Mr. Holmes. Just this, left on the step. He thanked her, shut the door, and slit it open with his letter opener. A faint scent escaped the parchment, lavender and ashes. Inside was a single line, handwritten in the same looping hand. Tonight at the observatory. Midnight. Come alone. Holmes read it twice and handed it to me. The curtain rises, Watson. By 11:30 we were crossing Primrose Hill toward the old Royal Observatory building, long since retired and mostly unused save for occasional public lectures and astronomical exhibitions. The fog was thicker here, sifting through the trees and curling around our boots as we climbed. Above us, the sky was a sheet of gauze, no stars visible. A fitting omen, I thought grimly, recalling the line. When the stars fade, the observatory stood dark, its dome outlined against the low cloud like a great sleeping eye. Holmes pressed forward without hesitation, a shadow among shadows. The door was unlocked. Inside, the chill wrapped us in silence. Holmes lit a small lamp from his pocket and held it high. The great telescope stood in the centre like a petrified giant, its lens pointed at a heaven that no longer looked back. There were traces of movement, muddy footprints, recent. Holmes followed them without sound, circling the dome's perimeter until he stopped by a low wooden bench. A body lay slumped across it, male, mid-50s, well-dressed, though his coat was torn at the collar and one glove missing. His eyes stared blankly upward, and a smear of dried blood crusted at the corner of his mouth. A cord was wrapped around his neck, not tightly, but symbolically, as though the real cause of death lay elsewhere. Holmes bent low, inspecting the man's face with grim precision. "Sebastian Clay," he murmured. "The old tutor." He reached into the man's lapel and retrieved a small paper, folded tightly. Another verse. He read aloud, the mentor who shaped, now silenced by art. The voice he once lifted now tears him apart. Each note, she recalls, is a blade in his chest. And now he lies still, in eternal rest. A soft noise stirred behind us. We turned sharply. From the shadows near the stairwell to the viewing platform, a figure emerged. A woman in a black veil, her silhouette long and severe, like a mourner from a forgotten time. She did not speak, but raised one gloved hand in a theatrical gesture, pointing skyward. Holmes took one step forward. "Elira Verlaine!" The figure lowered her hand. Then, slowly, she stepped backward into the dark and vanished down the stair. We gave chase immediately, our feet echoing on the narrow steps. But at the bottom, nothing. The rear exit stood open, and the night swallowed all beyond it. Holmes stood motionless in the threshold for a long moment. "She was here," I said breathlessly. "That must have been her." "Or someone who wishes us to believe it," Holmes replied. "She had the bearing of a performer, the timing of one, too." He crouched by the step and touched a piece of black fabric snagged on a nail. A veil, real this time, not a ghost's. We returned to Baker Street after 2. Holmes did not sleep. He paced for nearly an hour, smoking in silence before, at last addressing me. "There is a sequence emerging. Each victim is tied to Elira's past. Each death comes with its own verse. And the stage, always a place of performance or contemplation. A music hall, a recording room, and now the observatory. Clay's murder," I said, "was more symbolic than brutal." Holmes nodded. A voice teacher silenced. The cord, like a stage prop. Not the true instrument of death. Likely poison. "And the woman? Do you truly believe Elira's alive?" Monsieur didn't answer immediately. "I believe someone wants us to think she is. But whether the woman tonight was truly Elira Verlaine, or an impostor cloaked in memory, I cannot say. Not yet." He turned to the gramophone and placed the record again. The voice, aching, haunted, rose through the room once more. I could not help but shiver. "I need to speak with Mireille Garnier," he said. "Tonight, if she'll allow it. The deaths began with a song. They will end with one, and she may know the final verse before it's sung." Miss Mireille Garnier's flat in Hampstead was a modest, ivy-covered affair, tucked behind a narrow gate off Flask Walk. A light burned in the upstairs window, though it was past 3 in the morning when we arrived. Holmes knocked. We waited. After a moment, the door creaked open. A woman in her 60s stood before us, draped in a faded green shawl. Her silver hair was pinned back, her eyes red from crying, or lack of sleep. "I knew you'd come," she said softly. "Come in." The room inside smelt of jasmine and ink. Photographs adorned the piano, of young women in concert gowns, and one in particular, again and again, Elira Verlaine. Her face unmistakable, luminous in every frame. "You were her friend," Holmes said gently. "I was her only friend," Mireille replied. "The only one who stood by her when everything else failed." She gestured for us to sit. "I've seen the papers," she said. I knew about the girl in Soho. And then Clay. I suppose, Mr. Holmes, I suppose it's her, isn't it? You tell me, Holmes replied. Could Elira Verlaine have survived these years and returned? Mireille exhaled, then reached into a drawer. She retrieved a small parcel, old letters bound by ribbon. She wrote to me. From the continent. She was in Prague for a while. Then Paris. She lived, yes, but something changed her. Her words became strange, obsessed. She believed someone was following her. Who? She never said, just that he was always there. A shadow behind the curtain. She called him the conductor. Holmes's eyes flashed. The conductor? She said he knew her music better than she did, that he could make her sing without opening her mouth. Holmes leaned forward. Did she ever mention Darnley? Mireille's lips thinned, only to curse him. She loved him once. He ruined her, not by leaving, but by choosing someone else. Who? She never said, but she called her the understudy, the one who waited in the wings, smiling as the star fell. Holmes stood suddenly, turning away to the window. What did it? I asked. He did not reply at first. Then he said, She's writing a requiem, Watson, one voice at a time. Mireille stood too. There's something else. She sent me a manuscript, a score, months ago. Said it was her final composition. I never opened it. I was afraid. Holmes held out his hand. May I? She gave him the envelope. Holmes turned it over once, opened it, and his expression changed subtly, like a chord struck in a minor key. I looked over his shoulder. Inside was a sheet of music. The title, Dirge for a Forgotten Star. Beneath it, in the same looping hand that had written the verses, a single dedication for the one who lied when the bell rang. I remember now. Holmes turned to Mireille. This was never meant to be played. This is not music, it's a map. To where? I asked. To the last act, Holmes replied grimly, and the final confession. Chapter 6. The Mask Behind the Curtain. The morning that followed was heavy with tension, like the final note of a symphony hanging in the air before its echo faded. Holmes did not speak for some time, pacing the sitting-room of Baker Street with Mireille Garnier's score in his hands. He had cleared the table of its usual clutter, newspapers, tea-tins, loose files, and laid out the sheet music as if it were a crime scene. I watched from my armchair, my medical journal forgotten on my knee. Have you deciphered its meaning? I asked. He did not look up. It is encoded, Watson, not in letters, but in structure. The placement of notes corresponds to locations, the rests and bar lines to intervals in time. Are you saying this is a map? Yes, and more than that, it is also a confession. He tapped one corner of the sheet where a peculiar phrase was written in Latin, Cantus Dolorum sub nocte tacita. The Song of Sorrows under the Silent Night, I translated. Holmes nodded. A poetic rendering. But what is truly significant is the musical phrasing. It is not designed for performance. It is designed for recognition. Symbols strung in such a way that only one familiar with her voice, her past, and the places she performed would understand. Then she meant it for you, I said slowly. No, she meant it for someone else, someone she believed had been watching her all along. He turned to me, eyes sharp. The conductor. That name again. like a shadow flitting just beyond comprehension. Holmes began writing furiously on a blank sheet of paper, copying bar by bar the sequence from the score and correlating it to locations across London. When he finished, 5 names were circled: Covent Garden, Queen's Hall, Limehouse, the Old Avalon Theatre, and one more, here. He pointed to a corner of the city I had rarely seen. Southwark? I said, surprised. Holmes nodded. A forgotten chapel converted to a music hall in the 1840s, burned partially in the 60s, never fully repaired. I believe it is there that the finale is to be played. He stood abruptly and rang for Mrs. Hudson. Have the cab made ready, and bring my revolver. The Southwark Hall had long since fallen out of favour. Moss coated its stonework, and ivy climbed the rusted gates that barred the entrance. It was late afternoon when we arrived. The sun, low and pale, filtered through, a sky already greying with rain. Holmes picked the lock with clinical ease. The doors creaked open with a reluctant groan. Inside, dust floated like smoke. The hall was silent, too silent, the kind that implies a held breath rather than peace. The stage was still intact, though its red curtains hung like rotting velvet, half moth-eaten and black with age. Holmes walked straight to the foot of the stage and stood there listening. "There is someone here," he said softly. I scanned the shadows, but saw no one. Yet I could not shake the sensation of being observed. "Why, here," I whispered. "This was where Elura performed her final English concert," Holmes replied. "A benefit for the widows of miners lost in a collapse. She sang Nox Misericordiae, a piece she composed after her father's death. And then she vanished," I said. "Precisely." Holmes mounted the stage and stepped behind the curtain. I followed. There, behind the drapery, was a set of stairs descending into darkness. The backstage. He took out his lamp and descended, each step groaning under our weight. At the base, we found a corridor lined with cracked mirrors and broken costume racks. At the far end, a small door stood slightly ajar. Holmes approached it without hesitation and pushed it wide. Inside was a room. No, more than that. A shrine. Photographs of Elura lined the walls, all lit by candles melted into tarnished brass holders. Her face stared out from every corner, sometimes smiling, sometimes solemn, sometimes veiled. In the centre of the room sat a single chair, facing a battered upright piano. Sheet music lay open, and on the floor, freshly inked, was another verse. Holmes read it aloud. "The mask is the mirror, the voice but the shell. The heart that once loved now rings its own knell. And when all is silent and no one remains, the last breath will echo in musical chains. There was a sound behind us. We turned. Figure stood at the entrance, shrouded in a long black coat, a mask of pale porcelain covering the face. Not a theatrical mask, but one of surgical perfection, moulded without expression. Only the eyes showed behind it, dark and sharp. Holmes took a step forward. "I presume," he said, "I have the honour of addressing the conductor." The figure inclined their heads slightly. Holmes continued, calm as still water. "You followed her, didn't you? Not to protect her, but to preserve her, to collect her, like a sacred melody that must never be corrupted." Still no reply. Holmes went on. You eliminated those who touched her life, not because they hurt her, but because you believed they had. Clay, Darnley, now even Miss Mireille Garnier, if I'm not mistaken. The figure twitched at the last. Name. She's in danger, Holmes murmured. Suddenly, the conductor raised a hand, and from beneath their coat produced a conductor's baton. It gleamed faintly in the lamplight. Holmes remained unshaken. You're not a killer in the traditional sense. You're a dramatist, a director. Each death was arranged, not inflicted. But the threat to Garnier is real. Tell me where she is. Jim, last, a voice answered, low and androgynous, the accent faintly continental. She is where she must be. The last audience, the last aria. And with that, the figure turned and vanished down the corridor. We gave chase at once, but found nothing beyond the rear exit, save fading footsteps and the sound of distant rain. By the time we reached Garnier's flat, the front door had been forced. Holmes burst through without hesitation, pistol drawn. Inside, the room was in disarray, the piano bench overturned, the letters scattered, but Mireille Garnier was not there. On the music stand rested a single sheet, freshly inscribed with the final verse yet unfinished. Holmes snatched it up. The aria breaks where the silence begins, the breath of the past where the future thins. One voice shall remain. The rest was blank. Holmes turned to me. She's alive, but not for long. He paced the room, eyes darting from object to object. Then he froze before the fireplace. On the mantel sat a small silver box, engraved with an emblem I didn't recognize. Holmes opened it. Inside was a key. A label was tied to it, handwritten in Elira's unmistakable style. Finale. Avalon Theatre, midnight. We arrived at the Avalon shortly before 11:30. Rain was falling now, thin and cold. The theatre had been boarded up for years, but the key fit perfectly into a side door beneath the awning. Inside, the theatre was transformed. Candles burned along the aisles, their flames flickering against the ornate murals. The stage had been set, draped in red and gold, the footlights dimly lit. At centre stood a single chair, and tied to it, Mireille. Holmes breathed. She was bound at the wrists, a gag over her mouth, but otherwise unharmed. Her eyes widened as we entered. Holmes rushed forward, freeing her in seconds. Behind us, music began to play, not from an orchestra, from a phonograph, hidden somewhere backstage. Elira's voice rose through the theatre, low, mournful, haunting. The aria breaks where silence begins, the same unfinished line. Holmes froze. "Listen," he whispered. I strained my ears. Then I heard it. Another voice, soft beneath the recording, singing along. Holmes drew his revolver and sprinted toward the backstage corridor. I followed, heart pounding. There, in the wings, a figure knelt before an old phonograph, weeping as they sang. The mask lay discarded, beside them. She looked up. It was Elira, older, changed. Her hair grey, her face lined. But it was her. She did not flee. "I had to finish it," she whispered. "I had to bring it all to a close." Holmes stepped forward slowly, lowering the gun. "The conductor?" he asked. She smiled sadly. "He was real once, A man who taught me how to control breath, phrasing. But he died. I became him. After Prague, after the silence, he lived through me, directed the pain, composed the revenge, and Garnier. I couldn't kill her, she said. I loved her, but I needed her to hear the last song, to witness it. She looked to Holmes. Now it's done. Then, softly, she began to sing, the final verse. One voice shall remain when the others are dust. One voice in the silence, one voice you can trust. Let the stars fall, let the darkness begin. For I am the echo, and I am the sin. Tears streamed down her face as the last note faded. Then she collapsed. Holmes caught her before she struck the ground. She's still breathing, he said. Watson, call for help. I ran. Behind me, Holmes knelt beside Elira, the last note of the aria still trembling in the air like a memory. Chapter 7. Echoes in the Vault. Elira Rosenthal survived the night. We waited in tense silence at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, the clock hands crawling like arthritic fingers past the hours. I kept Holmes updated as the surgeons worked. There had been no wounds, no drugs, only utter physical exhaustion, as though her spirit had burned too brightly in that final aria. By dawn, she remained unconscious but stable. She meant it as a swan song, I said to Holmes, who stood by the window, eyes on the colourless sky. No, Watson, he murmured. She meant it as a warning. A nurse appeared with a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth. This was in her coat, she said. The attending thought it might be of use. Holmes took it wordlessly and unwrapped the contents. Inside was a folded manuscript, yellowed at the edges, its ink still dark. Holmes laid it across the waiting-room table, smoothing the creases with careful hands. She never sent this to the conservatoire, he said. She kept it with her. The title read, Nocturne pour un cœur perdu. Night Piece for a Lost Heart, I translated. Her first original composition, Holmes said, written the year her father died. She hid it away, unfinished, even as she rose to fame, scanned the final bars. Then his gaze darkened. Watson, this composition contains the names of her victims. I leaned closer. He pointed to a recurring motif, a descending trio of notes, always followed by a trilled sequence. Clay, Holmes said. Darnley. Even Madame Gautier, the Parisian vocal coach who vanished in '99. Their initials are buried in the harmonics, like a secret ledger. I was stunned. But why keep it with her? Why risk it being found? Because she knew she couldn't keep the story buried forever. She had begun to regret it. The murders, the manipulation, the madness of the conductor. This was her last act of control, a confession only someone who truly listened could interpret. A shadow passed over his face. But there is still something that does not fit. Elira believed she was the conductor, yet I am not certain she acted alone. You think someone else was involved? I think, Holmes said slowly. We are not yet at the coda. The next day, Inspector Lestrade came to Baker Street. His expression was tight with concern. Elira Rosenthal is under guard, he said. But she's not speaking, says nothing, looks past everyone. And someone tried to breach the hospital wing last night. Holmes raised his brows. Was the intruder apprehended? No, but we found this. Lestrade handed over a torn scrap of paper. Holmes read it aloud. The key was only half the door. Follow the silence beneath the roar. He tapped it thoughtfully against his fingers. Poetic, riddle-like. There's more, Lestrade added. The Avalon Theatre. Someone tried to set fire to it after we left. The entire backstage is scorched. Destroying evidence, I said grimly. No, Holmes countered. Destroying memory. The theatre is part of the sequence. We must revisit the places from her composition, the ones she encoded in her score. He laid the map out once more on the floor, adding the note's phrase beneath the circled locations. Beneath the roar, he murmured. Limehouse docks. Guessed. Roaring trade, steamships, traffic. Holmes nodded, and followed the silence, a place of quiet below all the bustle, a forgotten crypt, an old tunnel. The Thames sewer lines run below, I said. Old catacombs built around plague burial sites, too. Holmes looked up at Lestrade. Get me access to the Metropolitan Archives and a guide familiar with the old dock tunnels. Tonight we descend. That evening we found ourselves standing at the mouth of a narrow passage below Limehouse Pier, accompanied by a lantern-bearing city maintenance man named Rigby. The tide sloshed close to the edge of the stairwell that dropped into darkness. Not much down there these days, Rigby muttered. Collapsed passages, flooded chambers. But there's one vault that used to be a ferry toll chamber. Stays dry even now. Locals call it the Vault of Echoes. Holmes's eyes lit up. That is precisely what we are looking for. We descended slowly. The brick walls were slick with moss, and the air held the bitter tang of mildew and salt. As we passed into the main corridor, Rigby stopped abruptly and pointed ahead. There it is, but I warn you, people say they hear music down there. No one's been in for years. Holmes pressed on. I followed, revolver at the ready. We entered a domed chamber with surprisingly good acoustics. The stone was carved with old Latin inscriptions. Benches lined the walls, but the strangest feature was at the centre. A circle of music stands arranged in the shape of a star, and at the heart of it a single chair, empty. Holmes moved to one of the stands. Sheet music, he whispered. All blank, except this one. He lifted a page and examined it. Watson, do you see this signature? I peered over. A looping scrawl in dark ink. G. Mireille Garnier, I said. Holmes nodded gravely. It was not Elira alone. Garnier has been playing a part, perhaps coerced, perhaps willing. But this proves she wrote at least one movement of the composition found in the flat. She was the one in danger. Or made to appear so, Holmes said. Recall what Elira said. I couldn't kill her. I loved her. Garnier may have manipulated her affection, may have even orchestrated the madness behind the scenes. He knelt beside the chair and picked up another item. A glove. Fine leather. Perfumed. Holmes sniffed it, then held it out. Do you know this scent? I inhaled carefully. Ambergris. Rose. A trace of myrrh. A scent favoured in only one. Perfume, Holmes said. Voix perdue, made in a single Parisian atelier, discontinued 3 years ago. The one Garnier wore at the Conservatoire Gala. Precisely. He stood suddenly, eyes blazing. "Watson, we are chasing the wrong phantom. Garnier is not a victim. She is the composer of this whole performance." Just then there was a sound, a whispering echo. We turned. At the far end of the chamber, a figure stepped into the low lamplight, Mireille Garnier. She wore a cloak of deep violet, and in her gloved hand was a conductor's baton. Holmes spoke first. "Mademoiselle Garnier, I had not expected your entrance until the finale." She smiled coldly. "The overture is over, Monsieur Holmes. Now we begin the real aria." Holmes advanced, careful. "You manipulated her. You planted the symbols, the melodies, even the voices she believed were returning to her. You made her believe she was the conductor." "I merely gave her the stage," Garnier said calmly. "She filled the role, gloriously. You used her guilt, her grief." "Used truth," Garnier snapped. "Do you know what it means to be haunted by a genius you can never surpass? I was always the second voice, the understudy, the girl who watched the world worship her, until I found a way to turn her song into a requiem." Holmes took a step closer. "You murdered Darnley. You framed Clay. You even burned the Avalon." "I preserved the purity of the performance," she said. "Every death was a note, every lie a harmony. And now the final movement." She raised her baton. "Stop her!" Holmes cried. I rushed forward, but she flung something to the ground, a flare. The chamber filled with choking smoke. In the confusion, we heard her steps retreating down a side tunnel. By the time we gave chase, she was gone. Later, back at Baker Street, Holmes sat beside the fire, lost in thought. "She is not finished," he said. "Garnier's last act is yet to come. She sees this as a grand opera, one with a tragic final note." I nodded grimly. "And Elira? She is the key still. Broken, perhaps, but not silenced. We must speak to her. She alone knows where the next stage will be." He stared into the fire. "And we must be ready." Chapter 8. A Breath Beneath. The stage the following morning dawned ashen and cold, with a mist that blurred the outlines of the city into watercolour shades of grey. Holmes sat unmoving by the fire, his long fingers steepled, his gaze unfixed. For hours he had not stirred, not even when Mrs. Hudson brought tea and fresh rolls, which sat untouched upon the sideboard. I busied myself with the Morning Post, scanning the headlines. 2 murders still dominated the public mind. The singer and the tutor, both reported with breathless conjecture. Yet not a word of Mireille Garnier's deeper involvement had leaked to the papers. Holmes had insisted Lestrade keep it tightly contained. "Believes herself the master of the stage," Holmes said at last, voice low. "But even the greatest actress is subject to the playwright's pen. And she has overlooked one crucial fact." I looked up from my paper. "And what is that?" He smiled faintly. "The script has already changed." Before I could inquire further, the bell rang sharply. Mrs. Hudson entered with a card upon a tray. Holmes took it, scanned the inscription, and handed it to me. "Inspector Lestrade. Urgent." Holmes was already reaching for his coat. "Come, Watson. The next movement has begun." Betrothed, hansom clattered through the streets, the wheels sending up spray from last night's rain. We found Lestrade waiting for us at Scotland Yard. a grim look upon his sharp features. "She's surfaced," he said without preamble. "Garnier." "Where?" Holmes asked. Lestrade led us inside and into a small conference room where a large city map had been unrolled across the table. He tapped a point in the east of London. "Here, Whitechapel, an abandoned warehouse used by theatrical costumers. Place has been shuttered for years, but a neighbour reported lights last night, and this," he held up a folded scrap of parchment, sealed with dark red wax. Holmes opened it carefully. Inside was a single line of music, accompanied by a terse message. "Curtain call. Rehearsal tonight. Only one seat reserved." Holmes's eyes glittered. "She moves faster than I anticipated." He turned to Lestrade. "Double your watch upon St. Bartholomew's. Illyria must not be left unguarded for even an hour." Lestrade nodded grimly. "You believe she's the target?" "I believe she is the reason for the performance," Holmes said. "But Garnier does not act out of hatred alone. She acts out of need. She must complete her composition." He turned to me, his voice lowering. "Tonight, Watson, we attend a rehearsal, but not as invited guests." By nightfall, the fog had thickened into a damp, smothering veil, wrapping London in a damp shroud. We made our way on foot through the narrow alleys of Whitechapel. The streets nearly deserted, save for a few late workers and loitering figures in the mist. The warehouse loomed before us, an ugly, squatting structure of brick and iron, its windows boarded, its roof sagging like a weary beast. A single guttering lantern burned over the side door. Holmes drew a small coil of wire from his pocket and made swift work of the lock. Inside, the darkness was absolute. Holmes lit a lantern, shielding the flame with one hand. The space beyond was cavernous. Empty racks, heaps of discarded cloth, shattered mannequins, and fragments of stage scenery lay scattered like the wreckage of some forgotten carnival. But there, at the far end, stood a makeshift stage. A dozen folding chairs were arranged in a semicircle before it. Upon the stage, a grand piano waited, draped in black velvet. A single spotlight, rigged precariously from the rafters, cast a narrow shaft of light upon the instrument. Holmes crouched low, scanning the floor. "She has arranged a stage for us, Watson, but we are not yet ready to play our parts." He moved along the shadows, examining each chair. Upon one he found a folded sheet. He opened it with gloved hands. "Tonight, the lyre sings his own requiem. The final note shall fall at the stroke of 1. I felt a chill pass through me. Midnight, and the performance would begin. "Holmes, what are we walking into?" He smiled thinly. "A trap, Watson, but one of our own design if we are swift enough." We concealed ourselves in the shadowed recesses of the warehouse, Holmes choosing a vantage point overlooking the stage, but hidden among the remnants of old stage scenery. Hours crawled past. Midnight drew closer, and then, movement, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was Garnier. She wore a gown of deep violet, her hair piled high beneath a black netted veil. In one hand she carried a violin case, in the other a conductor's baton. Her movements were fluid, almost ritualistic, as she mounted the stage and placed the case atop the piano. Holmes leaned closer, eyes narrowed. Another figure followed. Enoch, Darnley, bound at the wrists, a dark cloth tied over his mouth. His coat was torn, his shoes muddied. Garnier led him like a puppet, forcing him into the central chair. Holmes exhaled slowly. The lyre. Her final aria is meant for him. Garnier turned to the piano, opened the case, and withdrew not a violin, but a pistol. I stiffened. Holmes's hand closed on my arm, steadying me. "Not yet," he whispered. Garnier circled Darnley with measured steps, raising the gun as if conducting an invisible orchestra. Then, softly, she began to hum. The same melody, the dirge. Holmes moved. In a blur of motion, he sprang from the shadows, crossing the distance to the stage in a few swift strides. "Garnier!" he barked. She whirled, the pistol aimed directly at him. But Holmes was faster. With a flick of his cane, he knocked the weapon from her hand. It clattered to the floor. I rushed forward. As Garnier backed away, eyes wide with fury. "You cannot stop the song!" she cried. Holmes seized her by the wrist and twisted, forcing her to her knees. "The song ends here, mademoiselle," he said coldly. "The audience has dispersed." Lestrade's men poured in from every door, their boots pounding on the floorboards. Garnier slumped, defeated. Holmes turned to Darnley, cutting the bonds at his wrists. The man sagged, gasping behind the gag, his eyes wild with terror. It was over, or so we thought. For as the constables led Garnier away, Holmes bent to examine the violin case once more. Inside, beneath the false lining, he found a final note. Written in Elira's unmistakable hand. "The conductor is dead, but the music lives." Holmes's expression darkened. "The curtain has fallen," he said softly, "but the echoes may yet outlast the stage." He looked up at me, his grey eyes gleaming in the lantern light. "Our performance, Watson, is not yet at its end." Chapter Soin, the Library of Lost Voices. The fog still lingered when we returned to Baker Street, curling against the windows like smoke trapped against glass. Holmes paced before the fireplace, the slip of Elira's note. "The conductor is dead, but the music lives," dangling from his fingers like a shred of prophecy. I sat nearby, nursing a cup of strong coffee, my mind struggling to reconcile what we had witnessed. Mireille Garnier had been arrested. The immediate threat to Darnley had passed. And yet Holmes's restlessness told me the case was far from concluded. "You doubt her guilt?" I asked at last. Holmes stopped pacing and turned. To me, his face lined with thought. "Not her guilt, Watson. Her completeness." He moved to his desk and spread out the artifacts of the case. The ciphered sheet music, the torn notes, the scorched remnants of the Avalon Theatre's program, the wax recording from the silent room. Each movement of this grotesque symphony bore Garnier's fingerprints, he said. Each death was orchestrated with care. And yet, his voice trailed off. I rose, setting down my cup. Yet, Holmes tapped the final note recovered from the violin case. "The conductor is dead, but the music lives." Garnier believed herself the architect of vengeance, he said. But she was also a performer, Watson. A performer directed by a larger, hidden hand. I frowned. "You mean she was used?" He nodded gravely. "Moulded, shaped, set loose like a sharpened instrument. but she was not the composer of the original theme. I crossed to the window and stared into the heavy mist. Then who was? Holmes said nothing for a long moment. Then, Elira Valenne. I turned sharply. But you said she was a victim. A victim. And something more. His eyes glittered in the low light. Mireille Garnier lit the fire, Watson. But Elira struck the match. He moved swiftly to the mantel and pulled down a battered leather volume. Annals of the Royal Conservatoire, 1870–1890. Before we confront the final act, Holmes said, we must understand the overture, and for that we must delve into a library no one cares to remember. By mid-morning, we were making our way across London to the Royal Conservatoire Archives, a sprawling dusty warren of forgotten scores, abandoned ledgers, and yellowed programmes. The building itself resembled a mausoleum, its stone facade blackened by decades of soot, its windows perpetually dim. A thin, hawk-nosed archivist met us at the door. "You have an appointment?" he asked, peering suspiciously at Holmes's card. "I have a mystery," Holmes replied, handing it over with a flourish. "And an urgent need for silence." The man sniffed but allowed us entry. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of vellum and mildew. We descended a narrow staircase to the lower vaults, where a maze of iron shelving stretched into shadow. Holmes led the way, his gaze flickering across the catalogue labels. Vocalists, 1870–1880. Composers, 1880–1890. Notable performances, Misc. At last he stopped before a battered filing cabinet labelled Student Records, Discontinued. "This," he said, "is where ghosts are filed away." He pried open a drawer and began rifling through the contents with practised precision. I assisted, scanning for any mention of Elira Valenne, or of the enigmatic figure Holmes now pursued. It was Holmes who found it first. A thin folder, its edges tattered, labelled in faded ink. Valenne, Elira Rosenthal. He opened it carefully. Inside were brittle sheets of parchment, enrolment forms, examination scores, performance reviews, and among them, a letter. Holmes read it aloud. To whom, it may concern, the student Elira Rosenthal is hereby suspended from all public performances pending investigation into unauthorized compositions and disruptive conduct. Complaints have been lodged by staff regarding her alleged influence over other students, her use of unsanctioned performance spaces, and the dissemination of unapproved musical material. Signed, R.S. Worthington, Director of Studies. Holmes exhaled through his nose. "There it is." I stared at him. "What does it mean?" He tapped the letter. Elira was not merely a prodigy. She was a revolutionary. She defied the conservatory's rigid traditions. She created new compositions, strange, haunting, unsanctioned, and was punished for it. Publicly, yes, but privately? He lifted another sheet, a list of disciplinary hearings. She was made an outcast, and Garnier? Holmes nodded grimly. There, her name appears twice, listed as a witness against Elira. A heavy silence fell between us. "She betrayed her," I said slowly. "Mireille Garnier testified against her." Holmes folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his coat, which means Garnier's vengeance was not solely hers. It was born of guilt, of regret, and of manipulation. He turned to me, his voice low. "Elira planted the seed of vengeance years ago, Watson. Garnier merely became the gardener." We returned to Baker Street as the day darkened into a watery dusk. Holmes sank into his armchair, steepling his fingers once more. "Watson," he said quietly, "recall the manuscript found with Elira at St. Bartholomew's, the Nocturne pour un cœur perdu." I nodded. There was something peculiar about it. The names encoded within were not random. They formed a sequence, one that mirrors the structure of a traditional mass for the dead. "A requiem," I said. Holmes smiled thinly. "Yes. And what is the final movement of a requiem?" I searched my memory. "The lux eterna, the eternal light." He nodded. "And what follows light, if not darkness?" He rose and moved to the window, staring into the gathering fog. "Elira Rosenthal," he said softly, "composed her own death long before she vanished. She wrote her own funeral mass, and she cast her betrayers as the choir." I shivered despite the warmth of the fire. "But why return now?" I asked. "Why, after all these years?" Holmes's face was a mask of iron. "Because, Watson," he said, "the final note has not yet been sung." He turned sharply. "There is one place left." I rose. "Where?" He moved to the desk and unrolled the annotated city map once more. "There." He pointed to a location I had not seen circled before. "The Royal Theatre, Covent Garden." "But it's been closed for renovation for nearly a year," I said. "Precisely," Holmes replied. "No audience, no distractions. Only the stage and the final voice." He seized his coat. "Come, Watson, we must prepare. Midnight approaches, and with it the end of the aria." We arrived at Covent Garden shortly after 10 o'clock. The grand old theatre loomed above us, its marble columns wrapped in scaffolding, its windows boarded over. A constable posted at the entrance nodded to Holmes and unbarred the heavy doors. Inside, the theatre was a husk, seats draped in canvas, chandeliers shrouded in cloth. The stage itself was stripped bare, its wooden boards exposed like the ribs of a great beast. Holmes moved swiftly, lantern in hand, scanning the auditorium. "There," he said, pointing. At the centre of the stage sat a single music stand. Upon it, there were a sheet of music. We approached cautiously. Holmes lifted the sheet and read the title aloud. "Lux Eterna, Final Requiem for a Forgotten Star." Beneath it a simple dedication, "To the one who loved too late." Holmes's hands tightened on the paper. "She means Darnley," he murmured, "and Garnier, and perhaps even herself." From the wings a soft sound echoed. A single note, sustained and pure. We turned as one. A figure stepped into the pool of light at centre stage. Elira Verlaine. Alive, real, draped in a gown of midnight blue, her hair loose about her shoulders, her face pale but serene. She lifted her arms and sang. The aria was haunting beyond words. A melody that spoke of sorrow and longing, of love lost and vengeance spent. It filled the vast empty theatre with sound so pure it seemed to erase the years themselves. Holmes stood motionless, transfixed. I felt tears prick my eyes, unbidden. When at last the final note faded, Elira lowered her arms and looked directly at Holmes. "You found the conductor," she said softly, "but not the composer." Holmes stepped forward, his voice low. "Why, Elira?" She smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "Because some betrayals," she said, "are written in the blood between notes, and only music can remember them when men forget." She held out her hands calmly. Holmes approached and took them gently. "No more deaths," he said. She nodded once. "I have sung my last." Chapter 10. The Hidden Score. The ride back to Baker Street was made in near silence. Elira Verlaine sat between Holmes and me, a spectral figure cloaked in exhaustion. Her hands resting limply in her lap trembled with a tremor that was more of the soul than the body. She had sung her confession at Covent Garden, but the full score, Holmes suspected, remained unwritten. The cab rattled over the wet cobbles, the mist thickening once more, closing us off from the city as if London itself wished to forget the night's revelations. Holmes, for his part, sat immobile, his hat pulled low over his eyes, his hands steepled beneath his chin. I knew the posture well. He was assembling the fragments, fitting them together with the patience of a master craftsman. Only this time I saw something rare in him, something close to pity. We reached Baker Street shortly after 1 o'clock. Mrs. Hudson, bleary-eyed but ever dutiful, ushered us in without comment. Elira sank into Holmes's armchair, as if the very effort of standing had become too great a burden. Holmes stoked the fire back to life, the flames casting long shadows across the walls. Then he turned to her, his voice soft but firm. "You sang your confession, Miss Verlaine. Now I require your testimony." Elira closed her eyes for a long moment, then opened them and began to speak. "I did not plan the deaths," she said, her voice scarcely more than a whisper. "I did not ask for blood. I asked only for remembrance." Holmes remained silent, allowing her the space to continue. "They forgot me, Mr. Holmes. They forgot my voice, my songs, my soul." Garnier remembered. She alone carried the echoes of what I once was. But even she— Elira faltered, her voice breaking. "Even she used me." Holmes leaned forward. "Explain." Elira licked her lips, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "When I returned to London, I sought only to reclaim my name. I composed the Lux Eterna as a testament, to be performed once, anonymously. A final offering to a city that no longer knew my face. But Garnier found me. She learned of the score, and she saw something else." Holmes's gaze sharpened. She saw an opportunity. Elira nodded miserably. To settle old debts, to compose a requiem not for me, but for those who wronged us both. I leaned forward. The killings, were they her idea? A shudder passed through Elira's frail frame. She said they would be symbolic. Representations, not actual deaths. Theatre. I believed her. She gave a hollow laugh. Foolish, wasn't it? I believed a stage could contain vengeance. Holmes tapped his fingers together thoughtfully. Yet you participated. Only at first, she said desperately. The music, the cipher. I thought it was poetry, code known only to us. But then the murders began. The silent room, the observatory. I tried to stop it, but by then, the conductor had taken the baton. Holmes's eyes gleamed. The conductor! You still believe in him? Elira flinched, and for the first time since Covent Garden, fear darkened her face. There is someone else, she whispered, someone behind Garnier. Behind me, someone who knew every step we would take. Holmes rose abruptly and paced the room, the carpet swallowing the sound of his footsteps. "You are certain?" he asked. She nodded. "Did you ever meet him?" "No, only messages, notes, a voice, sometimes, but never a face." Holmes halted before the fire, his silhouette stark against the flickering glow. And what did this voice say? Elira hesitated. "Sing," she said at last. "Sing or be forgotten." A silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Then Holmes turned to me. "Watson," he said briskly, "you will escort Miss Verlaine to Scotland Yard. Place her under protective custody. No visitors, no interviews, no music." I rose at once, sensing the urgency behind his clipped tone. "And you?" I asked. Holmes's mouth curved into a grim smile. "I must find the final sheet of this performance. Before the city hears its last, fatal note." By the time I returned from Scotland Yard, the dawn was already bleeding pale gold into the mist. I found Holmes precisely where I had left him, at his desk, bent over a series of maps, telegrams, and coded sheets. He did not look up as I entered. "Sit, Watson," he said. "We have work before us." I obeyed, suppressing a yawn. Fatigue tugged at my limbs, but the sharpened intensity of Holmes's demeanour roused me to full alertness. He pushed a telegram across the desk toward me. I scanned it quickly. From Lestrade, Mireille Garnier refuses to speak. Repeats one phrase. The score is incomplete without the final voice. Holmes tapped the telegram with a forefinger. Garnier's fixation was not solely on revenge. She believed she was completing a composition, one larger than herself, larger even than Elira. I frowned. A composition that requires a final voice? Holmes nodded. And who, Watson, might that voice be? I blinked. Darnley? He shook his head. Elira herself. Closer, he said, but not quite. Think. I racked my brain. One of her old colleagues. Another singer. Holmes smiled thinly. Or the one who first taught her to sing. The realization struck me like a blow. Sebastian Clay, I breathed. Dead, Holmes said grimly. But he was never the real master of her technique. He took credit, yes, but the true mentor was another. He reached into a folder and pulled free a photograph. Faded, creased at the edges. It showed a young Elira standing beside a man whose features were obscured by the photograph's decay. Only a vague silhouette remained. Tall, imposing, a figure of shadow. Who is he? I asked. Holmes tapped the photograph. A ghost, he said, but one who must now be summoned. By late afternoon, we found ourselves once again traversing the narrow lanes of Soho, following a trail that led not to theatres or conservatories, but to the forgotten quarters where London's past slumbered uneasily. Holmes had pieced it together from scraps, an old programme listing, a discarded telegram, a half-remembered anecdote from one of Elira's contemporaries. The trail led to a narrow townhouse, squeezed between two larger structures, its windows shuttered, its door bearing no name. Holmes rapped sharply. No answer. He tried the handle. Unlocked. We entered. The air inside was thick with dust and the scent of decay. Faded portraits lined the walls. Faces once vibrant, now mere phantoms. Sheet music littered the floor, curling and yellowed. A grand piano, cracked and silent, loomed in the parlour, and upon the piano a single sheet of fresh parchment. Holmes approached warily. He read aloud, "Final rehearsal. Midnight. The Vault of Echoes." I felt the blood drain from my face. "The Vault of Echoes," I said, "where we found Garnier's shrine." Holmes nodded grimly. "She was not the final player," he said. "Only the overture. The true conductor awaits." He turned to me, his eyes blazing with a light I had seen only on the precipice of revelation. "We must go back, Watson, back to the vault, back to where the echoes first sang." He drew his revolver and slipped it into his pocket. "This time," he said, "we meet the true composer face to face." Chapter 11. The Vault Revisited. The evening fell fast and heavy, wrapping London in a deep and stifling mist that seemed almost to congeal between the narrow alleys. Holmes and I crossed the city in silence, the cab rattling through near-deserted streets. There was no need for words between us now. The tension was a palpable thread, stretched tight as a violin string. We arrived at Limehouse Pier just before 10 o'clock. The waters of the Thames lapped sluggishly at the piers, their oily surface reflecting little of the meagre light from the gas lamps above. Rigby, the maintenance man who had guided us once before, met us at the mouth of the underground passage. His lantern swung nervously in his hand, casting jittering shadows across the slime-slick walls. "You're certain you want to go back down?" he asked, glancing at Holmes with unease. Holmes offered him a tight smile. "We have unfinished business below." Rigby hesitated. "You'll want this, then." He handed Holmes a second lantern, smaller but brighter, its flame well shielded against the damp. Holmes accepted it with a nod. "Wait here. If we are not back within 2 hours, inform Inspector Lestrade." Rigby paled but nodded, stepping back as we descended into the darkness. The stairs groaned beneath our feet, each step a hollow drumbeat. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying with it the scent of mould, and something older still, something the river could not wash away. We moved slowly, the beams of our lanterns slicing through the murk. The Vault of Echoes awaited us at the end of the long corridor, just as we had left it. Domed ceiling, crumbling stone benches, the faint suggestion of music still clinging to the damp air. Holmes paused just inside the threshold, his head cocked in that peculiar listening attitude he assumed when scenting danger. "Do you hear it, Watson?" he whispered. I strained my ears. A low hum, not mechanical, not human, like a resonance felt rather than heard. A deep thrumming note that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. Holmes advanced cautiously, sweeping the lantern in wide arcs. The star-shaped arrangement of music stands still marked the centre of the room. But now, upon each stand, a new sheet of music had been placed, fresh. Holmes moved swiftly to the nearest and scanned the notation. He exhaled sharply. "A fugue," he murmured. "A composition of voices, each echoing, overlapping, compounding." He turned to me, his expression grim. "This is no mere composition, Watson. This is an instruction." "An instruction for what?" I dared not ask aloud. We made our way to the centre, where the single chair still waited. Holmes examined it closely, running his fingers over the arms, the seat, the legs. There, Beneath the seat, he found it, a small, mechanical device no larger than a music box. He lifted it carefully, examining the intricate brass workings. "A timer," he said, "set to play a recording when triggered." He showed me a thin wire connected to a pressure plate beneath the chair's seat. Had Darnley sat here, he would have set it off. An auditory trigger, likely the final verse. "And then?" I asked, my throat dry. Holmes shook his head. "I dread to imagine." He pocketed the device carefully, then straightened. From the shadows at the edge of the vault, a soft clapping began. Slow, measured, mocking. We spun toward the sound. A figure emerged from the gloom. Tall, slim, dressed in a long black coat, his face obscured by a half-mask of polished silver. In one gloved hand he carried a conductor's baton, in the other a rolled sheaf of parchment. "The audience is punctual," he said, his voice rich and resonant, tinged with amusement. "The maestro is gratified." Holmes stepped forward, his lantern casting a golden halo around them both. "You are the true conductor," Holmes said. The man gave a shallow bow. "I am the composer," he corrected, "the librettist, the director of this grand opera of memory and vengeance." I gripped my revolver tighter. "What do you want?" I demanded. He laughed, a low musical sound that bounced eerily off the stone walls. "To finish the symphony, Doctor, to complete the chorus of betrayal, to see the final voice silenced and the overture sealed in blood." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You manipulated Garnier. You twisted Elira Verlaine into believing she was the architect of this madness." The conductor inclined, his head. "Of course, art requires sacrifice. Genius demands blood." Holmes's voice was calm, almost clinical. "You were her first mentor." "More than mentor," the man said softly. "I was her muse, her shadow, her inevitable destiny." "You corrupted her! I freed her!" he cried, his voice ringing against the vaulted ceiling. "She was trapped in mediocrity, strangled by a society that demanded obedience over brilliance. I showed her the way to immortality." Holmes advanced another step. "And who are you?" The silver mask glinted as the conductor tilted. His head. "Names are for the living," he said. "I am the final note in Elira's unfinished song." Holmes shifted subtly, positioning himself between the man and the exit. "You intend to kill her," he said. The conductor smiled beneath the mask. She sang her confession. Now she must sing her last. A sudden movement. The baton snapped upward, and with it a hidden mechanism somewhere in the ceiling sprang to life. The stone floor beneath the central chair began to shift, grinding open along invisible seams. Holmes darted forward, seizing the chair and wrenching it clear of the widening. Pit beneath, a deep black shaft yawned open, its bottom lost in darkness. "An oubliette," Holmes said grimly. "A pit designed to erase." The conductor laughed again, the sound hollow and echoing. "It is fitting, is it not? Forgotten by the world, forgotten by time." A voice swallowed by silence. Holmes drew his revolver. "Enough," he said. "Step forward and remove your mask." The conductor regarded him with a long, appraising gaze. Then, slowly, he did so. The face revealed was neither monstrous nor deformed. It was ordinary. A man of perhaps 50 years, with thinning dark hair, sharp grey eyes, and a mouth set in a permanent sneer of disdain. I saw Holmes's expression flicker, recognition, and something else. "You," he said quietly. "Richard Lysander. The name meant nothing to me." But Holmes went on, his voice cold. "Elira's original tutor at the conservatoire, expelled for unorthodox methods and moral turpitude. You vanished before the scandal broke." Lysander bowed mockingly. "I prefer to think I transcended." "You stalked her," Holmes said, "twisted her grief, fed her madness." "She was magnificent," Lysander said dreamily. "Even broken, she sang with a purity no stage could hold." He straightened, the mad gleam in his eyes sharpening. "And tonight," he said, "she will sing no more." He reached into his coat. Holmes fired. The two-shot rang like a drumbeat against the stone walls. Lysander staggered, a dark stain blossoming across his chest. He collapsed backward, the baton clattering from his fingers. Holmes strode forward and kicked the weapon away. I knelt beside Lysander, checking his pulse. Faint, weak. "He'll live," I said grimly. Holmes nodded once, retrieving the rolled parchment from the ground. He unrolled it carefully. It was the final movement of the fugue. But not a song, a map, a blueprint of the vault, with routes marked in ink. Escape routes, murder stages, the whole plan laid bare. Holmes turned to me, his expression carved in granite. "It is over, Watson, truly over." We rose as the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the corridor. Lestrade and his men, summoned by Rigby as instructed. Holmes handed the map to Lestrade without a word. As the inspector barked orders and Lysander was carried away, Holmes and I stood at the centre of the vault. The music stands still, standing like ghostly sentinels. Around us. Above, the river groaned against the stones. Below, silence reigned. Later, back at Baker Street, Holmes poured 2 glasses of brandy and handed one to me. We sat before the fire, both too weary for speech. After a long while, Holmes spoke. "Even now," he said quietly, "I can hear the echoes of her voice." I nodded. Some melodies, I thought, never truly fade. They linger, haunting the spaces between memory and silence. Holmes lifted his glass in a silent toast. "To Elira Valenne," he said, "and to the song that lived," I added. We drank, and somewhere in the depths of London's forgotten places, the final note of the requiem drifted into stillness. Chapter 12. The Voice That Remained. 3 days passed. The newspapers had a field day. Phantom composer captured beneath city, declared the Daily Chronicle. Maestro of murder unmasked in vault of echoes, wrote the Evening News. The Times, ever more restrained, simply printed, "The Valenne Affair, a tragedy in 3 acts." They got the number wrong. Holmes, of course, refused every interview. He sat for long stretches of time by the window at 221B Baker Street, unmoving, smoking in silence, while the rest of London raged and speculated and salivated over the more sensational aspects of the case. Elira Valenne remained under heavy watch at St. Bartholomew's. She had not spoken since the night of her final aria. She slept fitfully, ate only when coaxed, and refused all visitors save for Holmes. I accompanied him when he went, The private ward was quiet, its walls painted a pale, sterile white. Elira sat by the window, watching a grey pigeon preen itself on the sill. She looked thinner, smaller, folded into herself like an unfinished note. Holmes stepped inside quietly, his hands clasped behind his back. Elira. She turned her head. The lines around her eyes were deeper, her once luminous features drawn with sleeplessness and sorrow. "I dreamed I was still singing," she said, her voice hoarse but even. "But there was no one left to listen." Holmes didn't smile. The city listened. "Too late." He stepped closer. "You know what happened then?" She nodded. "Lysander. I knew it would be him. I just didn't know how far he would go." "You created the score," Holmes said, "but he rewrote the ending." She gave a bitter smile. "He always did." For a moment, only the sound of the wind brushing against the window broke the silence. "Do you believe I am guilty?" she asked. Holmes met her gaze. "Do you believe you are?" She looked away. "I don't know any more." Holmes sat across from her. "You're not on trial. Not yet. But there are things you must tell me. Truths that remain buried beneath all this music and blood." "I've told you all I know." He shook his head. "Not quite. You said the vault was the end. But it wasn't, was it?" Elira blinked. "What do you mean?" Holmes leaned forward. "There's another piece, another composition. One you wrote before Lysander, before Garnier. One no one has heard." Her breath caught. She looked down. "The Echo manuscript. Where is it?" She hesitated. Then, in a voice so soft, had to lean in to hear, "Buried. In the foundations of the old chapel at Southwark. I hid it before I left London the first time. I didn't want it destroyed." Holmes rose. "Then that is where we go." The chapel in Southwark was little, more than a ruin, crumbling stone and half-fallen buttresses overtaken by ivy. A rusted gate creaked on its hinges as we passed inside. Holmes moved with surgical precision, scanning the layout, eyes tracing the lines of broken pews and collapsed altar steps. "There," he said, pointing to a place where the stone floor had partially caved. Beneath the rubble, tucked within a weathered tin box, they found it, a manuscript sealed in oilskin, wrapped with twine. Holmes carried it as reverently as a priest might carry relics. Back at Baker Street we unwrapped the contents. The pages were still intact, the ink dark and clear. Holmes read it aloud, not sung, but spoken. The piece was called Fugue for a Future Unheard. It began with a simple melodic line, accompanied by lyrical annotations. But soon the lines began to branch, fracture, loop back on themselves. Each new voice introduced carried remnants of the first, but twisted, dissonant, deliberately broken. "It's not a composition," Holmes murmured. I frowned. "Then what is it?" He looked up at me, something dark flickering in his eyes. "It's a prophecy." The next morning, Inspector Lestrade arrived. He looked tired, worn thin by the press and Parliament inquiries and the endless speculation of the public. "We've charged Lysander," he said, lowering his voice. "He's not talking. Claims he was merely following inspiration. We've got him on 2 counts, possibly 3. He hesitated. But what of her? Elira? I asked. Lestrade nodded. Holmes spoke without looking up from the manuscript. You'll hold her for questioning, but not for long. She helped them, Lestrade insisted. She was used. Then she must answer for that. Holmes's jaw clenched. So must we all. Lestrade blinked, unsure how to respond. Iusche left without pressing further. That night Holmes and I sat by the fire again. The fugue for a future unheard spread across the floorboards between us. What do you see in it? I asked. Holmes did not respond for a long time. Then softly. She wrote this for herself, Watson. A self-portrait in sound. Each voice is a version of her. What she was, what she became, what she feared she'd become. And the last line? Holmes picked up the final sheet and read it again aloud. Let the voice break where the silence begins. Let the echo fall where no ear listens. One note shall remain when all else is gone. The one no one hears. The one no one sings. A silence fell over us. She knew, Holmes whispered. Even then, she knew she would be forgotten, that she would become a ghost haunting the margins of her own legend. I looked at him, and yet she sang. He nodded. That is what makes her. Remarkable. We returned to the hospital the following day. Elira was awake, sitting by the window again. Holmes placed the manuscript on the table beside her. I found it. She said nothing for a long time. Then, did you read it? Yes. Did you understand it? Holmes considered. Then, not fully. But I don't think anyone was meant to. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. I wanted to be remembered. You will be, he said. Her eyes filled. For the music or the madness? Holmes stood. Sometimes they are the same thing. By week's end, the papers moved. A new scandal in Parliament had replaced the headlines. The Vallon case faded from public conversation, becoming another ghost in the city's ever-growing gallery of unsolved horrors. But at 221B Baker Street, her song lingered. Holmes kept the fugue locked away inside a cabinet he rarely used. He never played it. But once I heard him hum it to himself. Just once, in the dead of night, as the fog drifted past the windows and the fire burned low. A low melody, fractured and strange, carrying with it all the pain, beauty, and loss of a woman who had sung. Too long in the dark. Chapter 13. A Note Misplaced. The storm returned 2 nights later. The wind howled through Baker Street, rattling the window panes with a ferocity that made even the gas lamps flicker in their sconces. Holmes stood by the hearth, unmoving, eyes fixed on the flickering coals, as though searching for a pattern in the flames. I sat across from him, rereading the pages of Fugue for a future unheard, for what must have been the 10th time. The melody still pulsed in my memory, even without being played. It had a curious effect, at once mournful and restless, as if the notes themselves longed to finish something they never quite began. It doesn't fit, Holmes muttered suddenly. I looked up. What doesn't? He turned toward me, his brow furrowed in that deep furrow I had come to associate with dangerous revelations. The timeline. Whose? Elira's. I set the sheets aside. You said she wrote the fugue before Garnier, before Lysander, Before everything, he believed that, Holmes said. I still believe she wrote the structure, but not all of it. Some of the motifs, some of the phrasing, Watson, they reference events that occurred after her supposed disappearance. You think it was amended? Holmes nodded, striding to the desk. He unfurled the manuscript beside his notes, pointing to a bar line near the end. Here. This sequence of descending fourths, do you recognize it? I leaned in. Should I? It mirrors the sequence found in the melody Garnier used in the silent room, he said. Almost note for note, frowned. You said Garnier was inspired by Elira. She was, Holmes said, but this phrasing did not originate with Elira. I believe someone inserted it into the fugue after Garnier's rehearsals. I sat back slowly. Who would alter it, and why? Holmes's voice dropped a register. To leave a trail. To embed a message, knowing it would only be found if the fugue were recovered and read. A message from Garnier. Holmes shook his head. No, from someone else entirely. He opened a drawer and produced a stack of telegrams. Fragments of investigation. Names of those connected to Elira. Her conservatory years. Her final performances. Watson, he said, we have been playing her song. But someone else wrote the final verse. The next morning, Holmes requested a meeting with Inspector Lestrade at Scotland Yard. We found him buried beneath paperwork, a cigar smouldering in his ashtray, and deep hollows beneath his eyes. You'll be pleased to know, he said, without preamble, that Elira has been officially cleared of direct charges. There's to be no prosecution. Holmes gave a short nod. Wise. Lestrade leaned forward. But she's leaving. Leaving. Back to the continent. She's booked passage on the Étoile de Lune, a liner departing Southampton in 3 days. Paris first, then Prague. Holmes's expression darkened. Slightly, not without speaking to me first, he said. Lestrade raised an eyebrow. She's under no obligation now, Holmes. You said yourself she was used. I did, but even used instruments leave fingerprints. Lestrade stood, gathering a stack of documents. You'll have to hurry then. We found Elira the next evening, seated alone in the hospital garden. The air was crisp, the grass damp with the remnants of the storm. She wore a grey shawl over her shoulders and sat unmoving, gazing into the middle distance. Holmes approached softly, his voice low. You altered the fugue. She didn't look at him. Yes. Why? To finish it, she said. To say what I never could. In words, I would have been punished. In notes, I could be forgiven. But the phrasing, Holmes said, crouching beside her. The descending fourths, the augmented intervals, that wasn't your voice. She turned to him at last. No, it was hers. Garnier? No, Elira said. My sister. The world seemed to tilt. I stared at her. You never said. No one knew, she said softly. Not even Mireille. We were twins, born 10 minutes apart, but only one of us was meant to sing. Holmes rose slowly, as if struck. She was the one who taught you to hide, he said, to compose in secret, to let others speak while you listened. She loved me more than the world ever did, Elira whispered. But she was not gifted. She could not perform, not like I could. So I became the voice, and she became the echo. Holmes's face was unreadable. What happened to her? Elira's eyes glistened. She died in 1895. Consumption, in a clinic near Marseille. But not before she left her own verses. Elira nodded. She wrote them into my fugue. I couldn't bear to remove them. Holmes's voice was like a blade now. Then who wrote the final bar? She blinked. I thought you did. He stepped back, stunned. You thought I? She nodded. You found the manuscript. You were meant to. Weren't you? Holmes turned away, one hand on his temple. It had all been orchestrated, but not just by Garnier, not just by Lysander. Someone else had been watching. Even now, that night, Holmes did not speak. He barely moved. He sat by the fire long after the embers had burned low, staring at the window as if waiting for something to appear beyond the fog. At one point, I placed a hand on his shoulder. Holmes, what are you thinking? He did not look at me. I am thinking, he said slowly, that someone else has been playing us from the first measure. Someone clever enough to stay hidden behind every verse. Lysander. No, he was an imitator, a plagiarist of pain. Then who? Holmes finally looked at me. His eyes were haunted, hard. I don't know, he said, but I intend to find out. The next morning, a letter arrived, unmarked envelope. No signature, no seal. Inside, a single sheet of music. No lyrics, no annotations, just 5 measures of melody. Strange, angular, almost incomplete. Holmes studied it with a stillness I had seen only once before, after the death of Irene Adler. This, he whispered, is not her hand. Then whose? He turned the page over. Written in a flowing, unfamiliar script were 4 words. Encore begins at dusk. Chapter 14. The encore at dusk. Holmes stared at the sheet of music long after the morning sun had filtered through the grey mist of Baker Street. He held it delicately, like something alive, something venomous. I watched him from my chair, uncertain whether to speak or remain silent. The 5 measures of melody were strange, deliberately jagged, lacking the structural elegance of Elira's compositions. Yet they possessed an eerie symmetry, a sequence of notes that rose too abruptly, paused, then fell again like a breath held too long and released too quickly. A pattern, I thought, a signature. What do you make of it? I asked. Holmes did not look up. It's a mockery. Of what? Of resolution. He placed the sheet gently on the mantel and walked to the window, folding his arms across his chest. This is not music, Watson. It's bait, written to be unfinished, designed to unsettle. I joined him by the window. And the note? Diog said it aloud with distaste. Encore begins at dusk. Where? I asked. That, Holmes said, is what we must discover. We spent the day combing through every lead Holmes had buried in his case files, every person who had worked at the conservatoire during Elira's years, every critic who'd reviewed her performances, every silent partner who'd invested in Garnier's disastrous final tour. Holmes worked without pause, flitting between telegrams and maps and old programs, pulling volumes from shelves with sharp precision. By mid-afternoon, he had compiled a list of 6 names, each circled in red ink. One stood out, Harold Veyron. The name meant nothing to me. Holmes, seeing my blank expression, explained, a minor composer, a failed critic, but once a librarian at the Royal Conservatoire. Dismissed in 1892 for improper use of student archives. What sort of improper use? He forged student records, Holmes said, rewrote biographies, assigned false credits. In particular, he claimed authorship of several pieces that were, in fact, composed by female students. I frowned, including Elira. Holmes nodded. 2 of her earliest works published under Véron's name in France. She never challenged the claim. She was 17, I murmured. She may not have even known. Or, Holmes said, she knew and stayed silent, perhaps under threat, perhaps under control. By 4 o'clock, the sky had already begun to dim. The fog outside thickened, and a strange hush fell over Baker Street, as though the entire city were leaning in to listen. Holmes turned from his desk. And I know where the encore will begin. Where? The conservatory. I blinked. It's been closed for months. Exactly, Holmes said. Under renovation, abandoned, empty, like a stage awaiting its final scene. He reached for his coat and revolver. Come, Watson, he said, the curtain is about to rise. We reached the Royal Conservatoire at 6:15. The building loomed like a mausoleum of memory, its once grand columns now wrapped in scaffolding, its windows shrouded in dust and silence. A single maintenance lamp burned at the gate, casting a pale orange glow across the entryway. Holmes produced a key. Borrowed, he said, from an old acquaintance in the Ministry of Education, and unlocked the side door. Inside, the air was musty and cold. Sheets covered the old furniture, paint cans and ladders leaned against the walls. The echo of our footsteps followed us like ghosts as we moved down the corridor. "Which room?" I whispered. "The old recital hall," Holmes said, "where Elira gave her first public performance." The door to the hall was ajar. Holmes pushed it open. What we saw made my blood run cold. Candles, dozens of them, lining the edges of the stage, placed on every windowsill, flickering atop the abandoned music stands. And in the centre of the stage, a piano, not the one we remembered, but a black lacquer grand, recently moved, recently tuned. Holmes stepped inside cautiously, scanning the perimeter. "Someone prepared this," I said. Holmes nodded. "They expect us." And then music, not from the piano, from above. A series of notes, faint and slow, descending from the rafters like whispers. We looked up. A shadow stood on the narrow balcony above the stage, obscured by the gloom, tall and still. Holmes's voice rang sharp across the hall. "Harold Véron." The figure did not move. "I know it is you," Holmes said. "You forged her work. You erased her voice. And now you wish to write the ending." The figure stepped forward into the candlelight, but it was not a man. It was a woman, tall, pale, with stark black eyes and silver-streaked hair twisted into a knot at the back of her head. She wore a conductor's coat, long, high-collared, velvet black, and held a scroll of parchment in one hand. Holmes stiffened. "Elira?" She smiled. "No," she said, "but thank you." We stood frozen as she descended the narrow side stairs and stepped onto the stage. Her movements were elegant, theatrical. She moved as if each gesture had been choreographed years ago. Holmes's voice was low. "You're the sister." She bowed slightly. "I was. I thought you were dead. That was the idea." She approached the piano and rested one hand on the keys, but did not play. "My name is Isadora Verlaine," she said, "but you may call me what they all did, the ghost." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "You wrote the final bar." "I wrote many," she replied, "more than they ever knew, more than Elira ever dared." I took a step forward. "You manipulated Garnier. You led Lysander to Elira." "No," she said calmly. "I gave them what they were already seeking. I merely shaped the story." Holmes advanced slowly. "You orchestrated their deaths." "I did not strike the blows," she said, "but I wrote the parts." She unrolled the parchment in her hand and placed it on the piano stand. A sheet of music, one line annotated in blood-red ink. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. Holmes studied it. "The final modulation," he murmured. "The transition," she said. "The moment when the key changes, when the melody collapses and something darker takes hold." "Why?" I asked, still stunned. "Why all this?" She turned to me with eyes full of something I could not name. Fury, longing, grief. "Because I was forgotten," she said. "Because I wrote in silence, behind doors that never opened. Because I was the first to sing, but the last to be heard." She pointed to the piano. "Elira's name was on every program, but my voice lived in every note." Holmes's expression was unreadable. "You were the echo," he said. She nodded. "And now," she said softly, "I shall be the finale." She sat at the piano. "Don't," Holmes said. She looked up at him. "You can't stop it, Mr. Holmes. You never could. The encore was written long ago, and once played, it cannot be unheard." Her fingers touched the keys. Holmes moved. I was beside him in an instant. Together, we rushed the stage, but it was too late. Her hands crashed down on the keyboard. A discordant, jarring chord shattered the silence. Then another and another. Music, twisted and broken. Half Elira, half Garnier, half nightmare. And underneath it, mechanical clicks. Holmes reached the piano and flung the lid open. Beneath the strings, a device, cylindrical, wired, hissing. "Gas!" Holmes shouted. "Out!" I bellowed. "Get out!" But Isadora remained seated, playing faster now, her eyes wild. "The silence!" she screamed. "You must hear it! You must hear it end!" Holmes wrenched her from the bench, dragging her bodily away as I flung open the side door and pulled both of them through. We stumbled into the hallway, coughing, gasping for breath. Holmes slammed the door shut behind us. Behind it, the music continued, then stopped. Dead silence, and then a soft, distant hiss, a click, and the sound of something burning. Outside, on the steps of the conservatoire, Holmes collapsed onto the cold stone, his face smeared with soot and sweat. I stood over him, heart hammering, lungs still raw. Inside, through the shattered windows, smoke coiled upward like the ghost of a requiem. Isadora was unconscious. Holmes had struck her, he confessed later, not out of violence, but out of necessity. She had chosen to burn the past, and all who listened to it. Holmes stared at the sky, his voice flat. She tried to erase the music. I sat beside him. But it still echoes. He said nothing more. And the wind carried her final notes away into the city. Chapter 15. Ashes and Echoes. The conservatoire smouldered for 2 days. By the time the fire brigades extinguished the last stubborn embers, little remained of the old recital hall. The great windows had shattered inward. The ornate plasterwork had collapsed in on itself, and the stage where Elira Verlaine had once sung her first triumph now lay buried under charred timbers and sodden ash. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street late on the second evening, our clothes still faintly smelling of smoke. Neither of us spoke much on the journey home. What words could match the final act we had witnessed? A sister who had composed her vengeance in silence. A voice that had waited 20 years to be heard, only to consume itself the moment the world dared listen. Holmes flung his overcoat over the back of a chair and went straight to the fire. Kneeling before the grate, I made tea, a mechanical gesture empty of comfort, and set a cup by his side. For a long time he said nothing. Only when the clock on the mantel chimed midnight did he speak, his voice low and expressionless. "She burned herself out, Watson, like a star collapsing into darkness." I sat opposite him, feeling the same hollow ache. "You saved her life." He gave a slight shake of the head. "I saved her body. The rest," he let the thought trail into the coals. Isadora Verlaine lay now in Newgate Prison, awaiting formal arraignment. Her survival had been grudging. The doctors said she had inhaled enough smoke and gas to kill a lesser woman, yet she clung to life. A final act of stubborn defiance, perhaps, or unfinished purpose. Inspector Lestrade had been swift to declare the matter closed. Arson, attempted murder, conspiracy, neatly filed under lunacy and tragedy in the bowels of Scotland Yard. But Holmes was not satisfied, nor was I. On the third morning, a letter arrived. No handwriting on the front, only my name, Dr. John H. Watson, neatly typed. Holmes opened it at my request, slicing the envelope with a letter opener. Inside, a single folded sheet, no signature. No greeting, just one line, typed in bold capitals. "The last note lies where the first was sung." Holmes read it aloud, his voice cool and clipped. Then he crushed the paper in his fist and hurled it into the fire. I watched the flames devour it, unsettled. "We missed something," I said quietly. Holmes stood abruptly, pacing the length of the sitting room. "Yes," he said, "we missed something. Something deliberate, planted, preserved." He stopped before the map pinned above his desk. A battered relic covered in ink marks and fading notations of London's underworld. "The first," he murmured, "where it began." "The conservatoire?" I suggested. "No." He turned to me, sharp now. "Earlier. Before the conservatoire. Before the silent room. Before even Harrington Gardens." He stabbed a finger toward a pin on the map. "Southwark," I frowned. "The old chapel?" Holmes nodded grimly. "She hid the manuscript there. The fugue, for a future unheard. But she said she buried it alone. And yet, the second fugue, the modifications, the codes, they reference a place only Elira's sister would have known." He crossed to the desk, rifling through papers. "We assumed the fugue was the last message," he said. "It wasn't." "There's another?" Holmes's eyes gleamed, not with triumph, but with something closer to dread. "The final composition," he said, "the one she wrote for herself, alone." By noon, we were once again riding through the grimy streets of Suffolk, the carriage wheels splashing through puddles left by last night's rain. The city had resumed its indifferent rhythm. Hawkers shouting on the corners, cabbies cursing in the streets, coal smoke trailing from countless unseen chimneys. But for me, it felt as though we travelled not through London, but through the final bars of some vast, unfinished symphony. Holmes said little. He sat stiff-backed, hat drawn low, hands folded tight in his lap. But I could see the tension coiled in him, like a wire drawn to snapping. This was no longer about law, it was about understanding, about bearing witness to the end of a music no one else would ever hear. The ruins of the old chapel were unchanged. We passed through the broken gates without challenge, stepping over fallen stones and creeping ivy. The air here smelled of wet earth and old secrets. Holmes led the way, moving without hesitation toward the half-collapsed altar. He dropped to one knee, brushing aside loose rubble. "Here," he said, and there, half buried under the stones, was a small iron box. Not the weathered tin of the first fugue, but something newer, sturdier. Holmes pried it open. Inside, a bundle of sheet music, meticulously wrapped in oilcloth. Holmes unwrapped it with the care of a surgeon revealing a wound. The top page bore a simple title, Requiem for Two Voices. We carried it back to Baker Street in silence. There, by the fire once more, Holmes laid it out across the table. It was not a long composition, no grand fugue or symphony, but a series of duets, intertwined and overlapping. One voice pure, soaring, the other lower, fractured, almost broken. Together they formed a terrible harmony, a dance of longing and resentment, hope and despair. At the bottom of the final page, a line written in a flowing, unmistakable hand. One sang to be heard, the other sang to be remembered. And beneath that, "Forgive me." Holmes sat back in his chair, his face unreadable. "She wrote it for herself and Isadora," I said. Holmes nodded slowly. "Two voices, two fates." He rose and crossed to the window, staring out into the foggy street. "The world heard only one," he said. "The other was silence given form." I stood, feeling the weight of the moment settle over us. "What will you do with it?" I asked. Holmes did not turn. "Bury it," he said, "as they should have been buried, together." That evening, we returned to the old chapel once more. No ceremony, no witnesses, just Holmes and myself, the ruined stones and the gathering mist. We placed the manuscript inside a new iron box, sealed tight. Holmes dug a shallow grave near the broken altar and laid the box within, covering it with earth and stone. When it was done, he stood a long moment in silence, hat in hand. I said nothing. Some griefs cannot be spoken aloud. When at last we turned away, the mist swallowed the chapel behind us, a mausoleum for voices that London had never truly heard. Later, back at Baker Street, Holmes struck a match and lit his pipe with slow deliberation. He spoke without looking at me. They will forget, Watson. They always do. A few sensational articles, a fading memory. Elira Verlaine will become a ghost story. Isadora, a cautionary tale. He drew deeply from the pipe, exhaling a plume of blue smoke toward the ceiling. But somewhere, he said, the music will remain. In echoes? I asked softly. He smiled faintly, a ghost of a smile. In memory, he said, and perhaps in silence. I raised my glass. To two voices, I said. Holmes clinked his glass against mine. To the ones who sang alone, he said. We drank. And outside, beyond the fog-draped windows of Baker Street, the city slept, indifferent as ever, but somewhere, in the hidden corners of London, the last notes of their requiem still lingered, unheard, but undying. Chapter 16. The Note That Refused to Die. 3 days passed. The streets of London returned to their indifferent hum. Cab wheels on cobblestones, the shouts of flower girls and newspapermen, the ever-present sigh of the river sliding past the city's forgotten bones. But within the sitting-room of 221B Baker Street, a strange quiet had settled. Deeper than the simple absence of conversation, heavier than fatigue. Holmes, usually so tireless after the completion of a case, moved through our rooms like a ghost. He read little. He spoke less. He spent hours standing at the window, pipe in hand, his gaze lost in the mist. Even Mrs. Hudson noticed, setting down our breakfast trays with a furtive gentleness that spoke volumes. On the morning of the third day, I found him seated at his desk, the old violin resting across his knees. He did not play. He only sat, fingers idle on the strings, staring at some point far beyond the walls of Baker Street. I waited until the silence became unbearable. You did what you could, Holmes. He did not move. They're at peace now, I said, both of them. The requiem was buried. The past is buried with it. Holmes's voice, when it came, was low and raw. Is it, Watson? I frowned. What do you mean? He lifted the violin, absently, plucking a single discordant note. The past has a curious habit, he said. It does not stay buried. Not truly. It echoes. He set the violin down and rose, pacing the room. We destroyed the final manuscript, he said, or so we believed. But art, true art, cannot be destroyed by mere flames or stone. I watched him, uneasy. What are you suggesting? Holmes stopped by the window, his hand splayed against the frosted glass. Elira's music lived on in Isadora's madness. Isadora's obsession was preserved in the fugues she left behind. And somewhere, someone else listened. He turned to me then, his grey eyes sharp and haunted. Someone still listens. The knock came just after noon. Soft, hesitant. Holmes stiffened. We exchanged a glance. Without a word, he moved to the door and opened it. Standing there, clutching a battered leather satchel to her chest, was a girl of no more than 16. She was thin, pale, with dark hair pulled back into a loose braid. Her clothes were simple, but clean. A grey coat, scuffed boots, her eyes, impossibly large and dark, lifted to meet Holmes's with a mixture of terror and determination. Yes, Holmes said, his voice carefully neutral. The girl swallowed. I was told, she began, her voice a whisper. I was told you could help. Holmes stepped aside without hesitation, motioning her in. I set aside my book and rose, offering a chair. The girl hesitated, then sat, perching on the edge of the seat, as if ready to flee at any moment. Holmes closed the door and returned to his armchair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "Who are you?" he asked gently. "My name is Celeste," she said. "Celeste Veyron." The name struck me like a blow. Holmes's only reaction was a slight narrowing of his eyes. "You are related to Harold Veyron?" The girl nodded. "My uncle." She fumbled with the clasp of her satchel and withdrew a bundle of papers, tied with a red ribbon. "I found these after he died," she said, "hidden in a music case in his house." She placed them carefully on the table between us. Holmes reached for them without a word. The ribbon slid away. He unfolded the pages slowly. Sheet music, handwritten. Not in Elira's fine script. Not in Isadora's jagged scrawl. A third hand. Bolder, more angular, but unmistakably related. Holmes flipped through the sheets rapidly. Each bore a title: Echo Sonata, Variations on a Forgotten Voice, Dirge for the Silent Twin. He looked up at Celeste. "Did you read these?" She shook her head. I can't. I don't know music." Holmes's voice softened. "Did your uncle say anything about them?" She hesitated. "Only that he said they were valuable, that someone would come for them one day." Her eyes widened. "I don't want them." Holmes leaned back slowly, steepling his fingers once more. "You were right to come," he said. Celeste rose shakily. "Can I go now?" Holmes nodded. She turned and fled down the stairs without a backward glance. We sat in silence as her footsteps faded. Then Holmes spread the sheets across the table. For over an hour he said nothing. He examined each page with excruciating care, marking notations in the margins, cross-referencing bars and refrains with the surviving fragments of Elira's original compositions. At last, he leaned back, exhaling slowly. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes's voice was grave. "A new symphony." I frowned. "Written by Veyron?" Holmes shook his head. "No, he was no composer. These were dictated." "By whom?" Holmes tapped the final page. At the bottom, in faded ink, a signature IV Isadora Verlaine, he said. "She survived," I murmured. "She survived everything." Holmes nodded grimly. "And she planned for this." He rose abruptly, moving. "To the fire." I followed. "What does it mean?" I asked. Holmes stared into the flames. "It means the music never ended, Watson. It changed. It hid itself. Within other hands, other voices." He turned to me, his face pale in the firelight. And someone, perhaps many, will carry it forward." I felt a cold chill settle over me. "You think Celeste's uncle intended to continue it?" "No," Holmes said. "He intended to sell it. To profit." "But others?" I asked. He nodded. "Others will not be so mercenary. Others will hear the notes for what they are. A call. A curse." That night, Holmes placed the new manuscripts into the heavy safe beneath the floorboards at Baker Street. He locked it with care. As he turned the key, he spoke without looking at me. "I cannot destroy them, Watson." I said nothing. He straightened slowly. "But I can guard them, for as long as I am able." Later, as the fire burned low and London slept beyond our windows, I found Holmes once more at his violin. This time he played, not a melody I knew, not one, written by any composer living or dead. A strange fractured tune, rising, falling, incomplete. Echoes of Elira, shadows of Isidora, a song not yet finished. I sat back and listened, letting the music fill the room. And somewhere in the fading heartbeat of the night, I thought I heard another note, a promise, a warning. The past never truly dies. It only waits. Chapter 17. The Choice. Beneath the silence, for 2 days, Holmes did not touch the violin. The manuscript sat locked beneath the floorboards of 21B Baker Street, and though hidden from sight, they seemed to fill the very air of our rooms with a quiet, thrumming tension. Holmes moved restlessly from window to desk, from desk to hearth. He lit his pipe and let it burn out, forgotten between his fingers. He refused all cases, no matter how urgent the telegrams that arrived in Mrs. Hudson's neat stack each morning. He was waiting or deciding, I could not tell which. On the evening of the second day, as dusk fell and the city outside blurred into mist and lamplight, he spoke at last. "Watson," he said, "do you believe that music can kill?" I set aside the journal I had been pretending to read. "Not directly." "No," he agreed, "not directly." He rose, pacing before the fire. "But influence," he said, "obsession, madness nurtured by melody, genius twisted into a noose. You have seen it." I nodded slowly. Elira, Isidora, Lysander, Garnier, all caught in its web. Holmes stopped, his hands clasped behind his back. "And now," he said, "I hold the last thread of that web in my hands." He turned to me. "What am I to do, Watson?" It was not a rhetorical question. It was a plea, rare, almost shocking from a man so accustomed to iron certainty. I chose my words carefully. "If you believe the manuscripts are dangerous, if they hold power to inspire such madness again, then you must destroy them." Holmes's expression tightened. "But if they are destroyed," he said softly, "then so is her voice." He crossed to the window, staring out into the thickening fog. Elira's voice, Isidora's grief, their truths, their lies, all erased, pressed a hand against the glass. "History is written by those who endure," he said, "and the world has already forgotten them once." I rose and joined him by the window. "You once told me," I said, "that the duty of the detective is not to write history, but to ensure that justice is done." He looked at me sharply. "And what is justice here, Watson?" I thought of Elira's broken songs, of Isidora's twisted requiem, of the young girl, Celeste, clutching her uncle's stolen treasures. I thought of the music still locked beneath our feet, notes waiting, whispering, promising. Finally, I said, "Justice is choosing the living over the dead." Holmes turned away. For a long time he said nothing. Only the sound of the fire crackling filled the room. The knock came just before midnight, sharp, insistent. Holmes and I exchanged a look. Without a word, he crossed the room, checked the latch on the safe beneath the floorboards, and moved to the door. He opened it. A man stood on the threshold, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the simple black coat of a common workman. But his eyes were sharp, too sharp, and in his right hand concealed, but unmistakable, a revolver. Holmes stepped aside smoothly. "Come in, Mr. Kestrel." I stiffened. The name meant nothing to me. But the way Holmes spoke, it told me everything. This was no random visitor. The man entered without hesitation, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. His voice was low, rough. "You have something that doesn't belong to you." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Possession is, I believe, 9/10 of the law." Kestrel smiled thinly. "Not this time." Holmes moved slowly toward the hearth. "And what is it you seek? You know?" Kestrel's eyes flicked toward the floorboards. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Yes," he said, "I know." The room crackled with tension. I edged closer to the bureau where I kept my service revolver, my hand drifting casually to the drawer. Kestrel's gaze flicked to me and back. "I have no quarrel with you, Doctor," he said. "Nor I with you," I replied calmly, "so long as you leave the way you came." He smiled again, colder this time. Holmes spoke before the situation could worsen. "Who sent you?" Kestrel shrugged. "No one you'd recognize." "A buyer, then." "More than a buyer," Kestrel said. "A patron, a guardian of sorts. Someone who believes that certain legacies should not be left to chance." Holmes's voice sharpened. "And what does your patron intend to do with the manuscripts?" Kestrel shrugged again. "Preserve them, study them, use them." Holmes's jaw tightened. "Weaponize them, you mean?" The man said nothing. The silence was answer enough. Holmes turned slowly back to the hearth. When he spoke, his voice was low and cold. "You have made a miscalculation, Mr. Kestrel." "Oh?" Holmes nodded. "You assumed that because I preserved the manuscripts, I valued them more than I valued life." He turned, and in one swift, violent motion, seized the poker from the hearth. Before Kestrel could react, Holmes drove it downward into the edge of the floorboards. The wood splintered. Holmes wrenched the safe free, dragging it into the open. Kestrel raised the revolver instinctively, but Holmes was faster. He flung the iron safe into the fire. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The safe struck the embers with a heavy thud. Flames licked greedily at the oilskin within. A muffled pop sounded, the manuscripts catching, and a gout of black smoke billowed upward. Kestrel cursed and lunged forward, but I was already there, my revolver drawn. "Don't!" I said. Kestrel froze. Holmes stepped between us, his hand raised. "No need, Watson." He turned back to Kestrel, his face hard as granite. "It is over," he said. "The music is ashes." Kestrel's eyes blazed. "You're a fool," he hissed. Holmes smiled grimly. "I am a librarian of the living." For a long moment, Kestrel said nothing. Then, without another word, he turned and fled into the night. We let him go. Later, as we stood over the dying fire, Holmes reached into the safe's melted remains with iron tongs. Blackened scraps of manuscript clung together, fused, unreadable. The music was gone, all but one piece. Holmes withdrew a single sliver of parchment, half burned. A fragment of notation survived, 3 notes, simple, rising, plaintive. Holmes studied it in silence, then he placed it carefully back into the ashes. "Do you regret it?" I asked quietly. Holmes stared into the hearth, the firelight carving deep lines across his face. "No," he said at last, "but I mourn it." He turned from the fire and crossed to the window, gazing out into the fog-drenched streets. "Some songs," he said softly, "are not meant to be heard." And outside London carried on, indifferent, unknowingly safe. For now, Chapter 18. A Memory in the Fog. The smoke had long since cleared from Baker Street. Days passed into weeks. The winter tightened its grip on London. Fog coiling through the alleys, ice glazing the iron railings, lamplight burning dim behind frosted windows. And life, in its tireless way, resumed. The newspapers, after their frenzy of speculation and scandal, moved on to fresher subjects: a jewel theft in Mayfair, a scandal in the House of Lords, the opening of a new opera season at Covent Garden. Elira Valen's name faded from the headlines. Her sister, Isadora, was quietly declared unfit to stand trial. She was committed to St. Margaret's Asylum in Surrey, where she would live out her days in a private wing, singing only to herself and the ghosts of a past that no one else remembered. The case was closed. The music was silenced. The past, it seemed, had finally been buried, but not for Holmes. I found him many evenings seated alone in the gloom of our sitting-room, the violin across his knees, the bow untouched beside him, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the window's misted glass, played little, spoke less. Once, as I passed behind his chair, I heard him humming softly, a fractured tune, half-remembered, broken in places like a mirror cracked by time. I said nothing. Some wounds cannot be dressed with words. It was not until early January, when the first fragile thaw softened the city's edges, that Holmes spoke of it again. We were seated by the fire, the last embers glowing dull and low. Holmes set aside his pipe and steepled his fingers, staring into the hearth. "She asked for remembrance," he said quietly. I glanced up from my book. "Elira?" I said. He nodded. "And her sister too, in their own ways." He fell silent again for a moment, then continued. "But we chose silence over memory. You chose life," I said firmly. "You chose to protect those still living." Holmes gave a thin smile. "And in so doing," he murmured, "we consigned their voices to oblivion." He rose and crossed to the window, hands clasped behind his back. "Perhaps that is mercy," he said. "Perhaps it is cowardice." The room was very quiet. Outside the mist shifted, and the cry of a distant gull echoed over the rooftops. Later that week, a package arrived for Holmes. No name, no return address. Inside, a small wooden box, plain, unadorned. Inside the box, dated a wax cylinder, and a note, written in a delicate looping hand, "For the one who listens." Holmes held the note a long time, turning it between his fingers. Then he set up the phonograph, an old battered machine we kept for occasional diversions, and placed the cylinder carefully onto the spindle. The needle dropped with a soft click. At first, there was only static, then slowly a voice. A woman's voice, clear, pure, haunting. It was Elira. We listened in silence as she sang, not one of her performances for the stage, but something private, intimate, a lullaby, in a language I did not recognize, perhaps Old Occitan, perhaps something older still. It was unlike anything I had ever heard. It was not a performance. It was a memory, a confession, a love song to no one and everyone. As the final notes faded into the hiss of the wax, Holmes rose and crossed to the machine, lifting the needle with infinite care. The room felt colder in the silence that followed. Neither of us spoke for a long time. At last, Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. "She knew," he said softly. "Knew what?" I asked. He held up the wax cylinder. "She knew her music would survive, not in fame, not in performance, but here, in the heart of those few who listened." He smiled faintly, a rare, unguarded smile. "Even in ashes," he said, "some embers refuse to die." That evening Holmes did something he had not done in weeks. He played, but not the jagged, fractured melodies of morning. He played the lullaby, softly, imperfectly, from memory. And I, sitting in my chair, closed my eyes and let the music wrap around me, a fragile, trembling thing, full of sorrow, full of hope. The notes rose and fell like the tide against forgotten shores. And for a time, Baker Street became something more than brick and mortar. It became a sanctuary for lost voices, for songs unsung, for echoes that refused to fade. As the final note quivered and died, Holmes lowered the violin and stared into the fire. "We cannot save everything, Watson," he said. "No," I agreed, "but we can remember." He nodded once, and that, I think, was enough. Epilogue years later, long after Holmes had retired to his beekeeping in Sussex, long after the world had moved on and forgotten the quiet tragedies of our time, I found myself walking past the ruins of the old conservatoire. The city had changed. The streets were busier, louder, the buildings taller, hungrier. But there, where the recital hall had once stood, someone had placed a small brass plaque. I bent to read it. Here once sang a voice that could not be silenced. Remember the forgotten songs. No name, no date, just those simple words. I smiled a little sadly, and for a moment I thought I heard, far away, carried on the wind, a single note, pure and unwavering. A memory, a promise, an echo, refusing to die.